love me so much more than I could ever know. Your love is deeper than this world will ever show. And all of life's beauty shines around this moment now. The sky and the cliffs, they seem to change my life somehow. And I will never be the same, will never be the same. Whoa, 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 I will never be the same, never be the same ever again. Well, here I am waiting, Lord, my life is just for you. Please unfold all the plans that you would have me do. And if all the world's just a breath and nothing's here to stay, then all of the love we feel will save us anyway. And I will never be the same, will never be the same. Whoa, I will never be the same, will never be the same ever again.
Hello and welcome back to another SDAQ&A. It's good to be back. I was away last week in Melbourne, Victoria. Did a few gigs down there and enjoyed my drive up and down the Hume Highway and the M1. Beautiful scenery, and being in a van, it's kind of nice and high up, and I got to see the beautiful landscape. If you ever travel to Australia, or if you're here and you get to travel that particularly from Goulburn to Holbrook. It's just beautiful. Anyway, it's good to see you all. Today we are doing a replay of Season 2, Episode 30, that incredible series we did all about Des Ford and Glacier View. And this is with Steve Ferguson, a lawyer, also an author, and I'll try and bring up on the screen his book. I think he's got a couple of books actually, and he might even be watching today. And this is 5 years ago. So those listening on the podcast, you're hearing my voice now from 2025, but we're about to launch back into the distant past. It was 40 years since Glacier View, and all the goings on that went and happened and occurred before and during and after. And it's perhaps one of the most important eras of Adventism, where the church, I believe, split in two and to this day have not realized it. Those who followed the new theology of Des Ford and similar biblical views that he held, not necessarily his teachings, but many in the 60s and 70s were trying to move away from Ellen White's authority and get back to a more Bible-based view of Adventism. So it really divided the church. There has been many times when the church has had potential splits, 1888, 1851, even its beginnings of 1844, 1919. My belief that the public release of Questions on Doctrine in 1957 created the fertile soil, because it was a presentation to the world of what Adventism is. Hey, this is what we are. It was no longer just all in-house. And that book, when traditional Adventists read it, were like, whoa, hang on, what's going on? This is not our Adventism. And they set about to get rid of the new theology. And it's interesting now when you talk about the new theology, the traditional Adventists all shout out, that's not my Adventism. And when you present the traditional Adventism and say, well, this is really what historically Adventism is all about, the new theology people go, that's not our Adventism, which to me confirms and validates my claim that, yeah, there's really two churches. Of course, there's many different divisions and categories. I'm not trying to label you all, but you Adventists exist in two groups. And I've used this little graph a few times. It doesn't hurt to bring it up again. Where's it gone? Maybe it's disappeared. Oh, it has. But we've got our leadership as one group. We've got the historical, traditional Adventists on one side, and the other side we've got a variety of Adventists that like to be diverse, but all of them have Ellen White a little bit further back. And then there's a subset of cultural Adventists. So there's several groups within Adventism, of course, but there's two theologies. And even within the traditional Adventists, they've got some differences of opinion, but generally speaking, they hold to the pillars of Adventism. And the liberal progressive Adventists, they can't be categorized. They don't like to be pinned down. And but they hold essentially, basically, a very different theology. And to me, that defines two separate theologies in the one. And that's why Adventists always clash. You go to a town anywhere in Australia, America, New Zealand, Europe, particularly USA, Canada, here in New Zealand, and you'll go to a town and you'll ask which is the liberal church and which is the conservative church. They're split and they don't like each other. The progressives say they are inclusive and want to accept the traditionals, but really they find the theology of traditional Adventism a thorn in their side. And equally, the progressive traditional Adventists, as they ruminate and look at all these progressive, hippie, long hair, liberal, that's not my Adventism Adventists. They don't want those guys around either. They're a thorn in their side. And I don't really know what the solution is, but maybe admitting it in the first place is a good start. What I have learned is that both sides love Ellen White. Even the ones that push her back a bit, they'll say, yes, but what an inspirational woman, a woman of her time. And we have churches and schools and hospitals. Look at what the fruit of this has been. Whereas I tend to think, look, there are teachings she claimed were true that have turned out to be false teachings. And she claimed that God gave her those teachings in the first place. So there's a bit of a confusing conundrum there. And yet, progressive Adventists say, well, she said, go to the Bible alone. But the church claims to have a unique message for the end of time. So if you water that down and take away the pillars of Ellen White's sanctuary doctrine, etc., you don't have that special, unique message anyway. So there's one group that has the special, unique message. There's one group that would like to be more Protestant. And Glacier View occurred when Des Ford's theology was considered a little bit too dismissive of Ellen White's authority. And so October 27, 1979, Des did a forum meeting where he outlined in 1 hour, it's an incredible talk, it's here on the channel somewhere, where he outlined his view of the sanctuary doctrine, Ellen White, etc. And that led to Glacier View, which was August 1980, I think. And what's interesting about today's program, and that split the church because Des was treated badly during that program that week, where essentially people came to a consensus and said, hey, look, we can all agree, but leadership, Neil Wilson, Athol Tolhurst, Keith Parmenter, the line has already been drawn in the sand. Before Glacier View, they knew that. And there's some letters between Pearson and Wilson that indicate, Ford's got to go. And we've got to end this whole righteousness by faith thing that minimizes Ellen White's authority. He's got to go. And I believe they wanted to make an example of him, and they did. So post-Glacier View, there was many, many distraught progressive leaders and liberal leaders, people like Larry Geraghty, Fritz Guy. These guys were like, whoa, hang on, we thought we were moving towards a more progressive Bible-based church, and the administration have stomped that. So Glacier View, wow, I think, the most defining occurrence in Adventism as far as the ramifications that are ongoing, not ceasing, never ending, never being resolved. So these two sides have got to get out of each other's hair, essentially. And what's interesting about today's program, as we really look at Season 2, Episode 30, is Steve Ferguson is a lawyer. And he's fascinated by the whole Glacier View case. And so we are looking today at a lawyer's assessment of Glacier View. And this was 5 years ago, which was the 40th anniversary of Glacier View. And now we are into the 45th year post-Glacier View. So sit back and relax and enjoy this replay of that incredible interview with Steve Ferguson. I think you'll find it enjoyable and informative. One last quick thing. Tonight, in about, 9 hours from right now, John Rosier is on the show. I won't be doing a show tomorrow because I'm doing John Rosier's tonight. So those of you that want to watch 2 shows a week, you can watch now. Awesome. And tomorrow, just watch the John Rosier interview. Or if you're a night owl, watch it with me tonight, 10 p.m. Australian time. Who knows what that is in US time? I know it's 9 a.m. in London. So, yeah, as you know, John Rosier is an incredible mind, incredible person. And he and I will be chatting about what Adventism could have been. So if you missed that, if you can't watch that tonight, that's tomorrow's show. Just watch it back. Anyway, without further ado, here is Stephen Ferguson. Being the youngest person, 40, so you were born that year.
I was born in 1979, so I'm 41 this year, so I was born in 1979, so less than a year old, I think, when SDAQ happened.
What month were you born?
September.
Oh, right. So just in time for the famous forum. You would have been a month old when the famous forum meeting went out. So we'll dig back into a little bit about that time frame. And I just want to say one more thing beforehand, is you're probably one of the few people that actually have read the 1,000-page document that Jill has now divided into three little books. And tell us a bit about that and what brought you to reading that book.
There's a bit of a sort of a backstory, just shortened version. So several years ago, just for fun, I did a theology degree, but I did it outside of any Adventist institution. I didn't go to Avondale. I did it through an Anglican Uniting Church seminary.
Wow.
I did that deliberately because I didn't want to, I didn't want to have the sort of confirmatory bias of being in my own group. So, and that was a very challenging experience, and I'm still here. So as a result of that experience, I sort of wrote a book about my experience.
Wow.
And in that book, I kind of talked about the SDA fundamental beliefs and how not really all fundamental, and I'm not the first person to have said this, not all fundamental beliefs really are as fundamental as others. And then talking about the sort of, the pre-Advent investigative judgment sanctuary message, basically said, in my experience, it's not really a fundamental belief anymore. And most people sort of my age or younger, and I've done this test many times, even very conservative Adventists, ask them, please explain to me, calculate the 2,300 year prophecy, explain it, can't do it.
Yeah.
Not really up there with, righteousness by faith or the Trinity or the Sabbath or State of the Dead. But in my book, I said, kind of intimated, I thought Desmond Ford in a way won the war, even though he lost the battle.
Yeah.
In a certain way. But I use the example of Dale Raslaff. He's a very sort of anti-Adventist. He was a casualty of this whole situation, and he's very sort of anti-Adventist. And I did say he probably deserves an apology, but it'd be hard for him to think that, in a certain way, of thinking it was all for nothing, because young Adventists don't really know or care about much of this.
That's right.
He obviously read my book or read a portion of it and was very aggrieved and contacted Desmond Ford, who was still alive at that time. And then Gillian Ford approached me. And at that stage, it was not on friendly terms, although I think we're good friends now. It was not on friendly terms and challenged me as to my views about the whole situation. I confessed I didn't know a whole lot about it because, I was, a month old when it all went down. So she guided me in terms of where all the original source material was. And I think there was an unofficial transcript of Glacier View. I think the official transcript's still under lock and key in the General Conference archives, but there's an unofficial transcript. All the different Spectrum and ministry articles, the private letters, and of course the original 991-page manuscript. So it's not just his manuscript. There's probably like 2,000 pages of material, and then I read all 2,000 pages of material.
Wow.
And as a result of that, I wrote 2 articles, one in Adventist Today, which is more about the theology, and one in Spectrum, both independent Adventist journals, people don't know, about more of the legal process, putting my lawyer's hat on. Yeah. So that's kind of the background. So it very much started sort of by coincidence. And I should just say, I think what I bring to this discussion is I don't have any personal connection. I don't have any sort of animosity one way or the other. You know, a lot of people talk about how Desmond Ford was a charismatic guy, and some people loved him and some people hated him. And well, obviously I didn't approach any of this from that perspective.
Yeah.
So I like to think I bring not completely objective, but a more objective view of the whole matter, because there isn't any personal. I'm not a church employee. I'm not going to get any gold stars or any red crosses. What I say. So
Yeah. I love that. It's one of the reasons why I've been really looking forward to having this conversation, because of that kind of ability for you to almost approach it as from an observer, and it's a non-biased, like you say, you're not going to have the confirmation bias there. Hey, just one technical thing. Can you just tilt your, yeah, just tiny bit forward. That's it. Just so we can see your whole face. And, and I like the idea that you're approaching it from a kind of a theological point of view, and this is an interesting story. Let's dig a bit into that. But you're also putting your, as you said, your lawyer's hat on and approaching it from a, because one of your articles is about approaching it from a legal perspective. You know, what would happen if Des Ford was on trial? And there was something ironic you said before.
I think he was on trial.
Oh, he was on trial, but maybe it was a kangaroo court.
Well, that's the question, yeah.
So I want to kind of explore both sides of this. We'll put your theology hat on first, and then we'll kind of come to the lawyer legal viewpoint. And you're right. A lot of young people just don't even care about this kind of thing. And isn't that interesting? Ellen White called the sanctuary the foundation stone upon which the most important pillar of Adventism lays. The sanctuary, the investigative judgment. And a lot of people say, well, she changed her view from obviously from the shut door theory, the shut door vision, right through to when she was writing Patriarchs and Prophets and Desire of Ages and these kind of works. The sanctuary doctrine has shifted and changed. And you just said also that in some ways Des won, because many people, young people today, view this the new sanctuary doctrine as being about grace and righteousness by faith, and they're not even concerned. Is it therefore a topic we shouldn't even really have to worry about and just hope it disappears and goes away? Or do you, in your research, have you found percolating underneath the troubles about to jump forth?
The essence of the theological problem is really like a psychological problem, and this gets out of it. The fear that really drove Glacier View is what I can get to the bottom of it, is a fear that if 1844 wasn't as we say it was, or our pioneers say it was, then they were duped, and therefore our movement was built on a lie. And I think that gets to the heart of it. But the essence of how they handled it theologically and why it was handled so poorly is, I think they thought Desmond Ford was trying to destroy the foundation of Adventism, whereas what actually he did is they thought he was like the torpedo sinking it. He actually provided the life raft, and if you actually read his whole manuscript, what he says, he doesn't quite say what I think people think he says. And he didn't, yes, he challenged it, but he didn't destroy it, or at least not in 1980, he didn't destroy it. He actually gave a bit of a way of escape or explained it. Yeah. And I think it will, in some ways, there'll be part of Adventism, it just won't ever be an issue. But for another part of Adventism, it does go to the sort of existential notion of how our movement was founded. Yeah. And as it's 176 years since 1844, how long does it take God to conduct these trials in heaven? Yeah. And it will get to a point, and this kind of almost gets to the end point first. I think for Dr. Ford's original viewpoint in 1980, not saying whatever he believed at the end of his life or what other people have said, what he said in 1980, my prediction is it will actually be the established position, because it actually provides a way of explaining through his apostolic principle, and we can discuss that. It actually explains how the pioneers weren't dupes and were correct in what they viewed, but at the same time, it doesn't link us to sort of, one potentially poor way of reading the Bible.
Yeah, yeah, that's fascinating. So, are you concerned? Again, you're not really, like you say, you're not personally connected. So, concerned is not the right word. But from your observations, have you noticed that the son of Neil Wilson, who was presiding at the time, Ted Wilson, is now in power, and major demonstrable steps are being taken to, if there was another Des Ford now, to defrock that kind of a person within the church? Or do you think that no, we are actually moving towards a more Bible-based righteousness by faith viewpoint?
Obviously, there's Adventism goes in ebbs and flows like politics, and we've gone a more reactionary way. But I will say one thing about Ted Wilson: he's very strong on. There's a weird sort of synergy between some of the things that he says and some of the things that Desmond Ford said. And I'm sure both Desmond Ford supporters and Ted Wilson's supporters will scream at me and say it can't be true. And the synergy is in last generation theology, which I don't subscribe to at all. But there's this idea that we hasten or delay the coming of the Lord.
Mm.
And that Ted Wilson that seems to be the key argument as to why Jesus hasn't returned yet.
Yeah.
But the key argument from Desmond Ford's theology, which I do subscribe to, is this idea of the apostolic-matic principle, which is the idea that prophecies have multiple fulfillments, and things can be fulfilled multiple times, and there can be delays. So, when the children of Israel got to the promised land, they didn't just walk in. They screwed up, turned around, walked back in the desert, and they were in the desert for another 40 years. And so that idea fits quite nicely with both what Desmond Ford and Ted Wilson have both said. And Desmond Ford, the essence of Desmond Ford's view, as I understand it, is 1844 was not the fulfillment of Daniel 8:14, but it was a fulfillment of Daniel 8:14, and that there's been multiple fulfillments, and there may be further fulfillments. And so our pioneers weren't dupes to think when they lived, they weren't dupes to think that 1844 was a fulfillment. They were correct, or they had a good idea. And I can read a passage from Desmond Ford's manuscript that says that, page 470, I think he says that. Actually, I might just quickly read it.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Seconds. Just because it's hard to argue. So he says, in his 1980 manuscript, he says, "What shall we say about 1844 and the investigative judgment? On 1844, we shall say that in the providence of God, he brought to the birth the movement with the last message for the world, the three angels' message in veracity, justification by faith. That message in all its elements of law and grace, obedience and faith, justification and sanctification, substitution, imputation and representation, judgment and the second advent, is beautifully enshrined in the symbolism of the sanctuary, particularly the most holy place with its ark and mercy and seat. In claiming that Daniel 8:14 pointed to the last judgment and the end of the world, we were miles ahead of our contemporaries in seeing Daniel 9:24 and 7:9-13 as explanatory of 8:14. We were similarly advanced, and in fixing upon that commandment at the heart of the law, in the centre of the sanctuary, as the sign of the gospel, we offered a test of loyalty to the world, which ultimately will decide the destiny of all." And this is the key sentence, most one. 1844 and the Advent movement are indeed a fulfilment of Daniel 8:14, an apostolic-matic fulfilment in the same sense that AD 70 was a fulfilment of Matt 24 and John the Baptist, Malachi 4:5-6, and the Pentecost, Joel 2:8-28. So the point is, Desmond Ford said Daniel 8:14, that's the 2,300-year prophecy that they were arguing about, was a fulfilment of 1844 was a fulfillment of Daniel 8:14. He just said it wasn't the fulfillment.
Does that imply? Does that imply that back in 1980, that Des was actually believing that there was a supernatural element to the night of October 22, 1844?
I can't recall that off the top of my head. I think people have been asked, was there anything happening in heaven? And I think the problem is, I think he probably suggests he doesn't. I mean, Gillian Ford will probably come pipe in and say whether I'm right or wrong.
I know what he came to believe.
I mean, then Yeah, I mean, the next paragraph of that's page 470 or 471. It says it's all metaphor. So I think it's probably hard to say what's actually happening in heaven because it's all metaphor.
Mm.
My own personal view is, sure, maybe there is something happening, but I think my view would be that it wouldn't have been. There could have been something happening in heaven. I doubt there's sort of literal. Well, there may be, but I doubt there's a literal, architect.
No. But even so, take away the literal, just supernatural. Like one of the defining things, regardless of your thoughts on the sanctuary or investigative judgments or knowledge about those themes and ideas, if you can boil it down to, do you think something supernatural happened that night or not? Now, you can then go, well, providentially, the Adventist Church grew and we've got the school.
Desmond Ford, in that paragraph, does seem to suggest God had set the Adventist Church apart based on that understanding.
Yeah.
So something obviously is happening supernaturally.
Yeah.
I think the problem was, we think that is, the traditional view is 1844 is the beginning of the end. It's the end times.
Yeah.
Desmond Ford is perhaps saying, yes, it's the beginning of the end times, but it wasn't the only beginning of the end times. So,
right.
So it's a bit like
a little reminder.
I hate to use the analogy. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Matrix.
I love The Matrix.
In number 2, Matrix number 2, Neo, the main character, he gets to the prophecies fulfilled, and he thinks he's the chosen one, and he realizes he's actually the 13th time someone has fulfilled the prophecy.
That's right.
Obviously, he eventually breaks the mold. But that's how this sort of apostolic principle works, as I understand it. That there's prophecies and they get fulfilled or applied, but it's not just once until there is a final fulfillment.
Well, why would God hide within an end time prophecy a little bit of a gem of a reminder for where the church should go when we're warned not to search or go down the rabbit hole of trying to work out dates and times?
Good question. You could say, why is Revelation written in such weird language, that it's open to many interpretations? I think part of the reason is because in different periods of history, God's people do these sort of investigations and read it as applying to them.
Yeah.
And I think that God's written, the Bible's written in such a way for that purpose. You could say pioneers applied sort of bad exegesis to the Bible, but the whole Bible, there's lots of prophecies that there's arguably bad exegesis. And I'll give one example, and I don't want to destroy the faith of your listeners, but how as Christians, we believe there's a virgin birth, right? And I believe that, but that's because the New Testament apostles, and I believe it literally was a virgin birth, but there's sort of a bit of bad exegesis there because the idea of the Messiah coming from a virgin is based on the Greek Septuagint version of the Old Testament. In the Hebrew, it suggests it's just a maiden.
Yeah. So
that's why many early Jewish Christians didn't believe Jesus had a virgin birth. So the only point I'm trying to say then is, I can't sort of look at the SDA pioneers and say, well, they were all dupes because they applied bad exegesis.
Yeah.
I don't think they could have interpreted it better, but I think it was open to them to come to a view. And that's the essence of what Desmond Ford's saying in that paragraph.
Yeah.
He's affirming to those who are worried that he's trying to destroy Adventism that no, the pioneers weren't dupes.
Yeah.
They were streets ahead at that time, but they need to realise it's a fulfilment, not the fulfilment of Daniel 8:14.
Yeah, I agree, and I would never even try and reflect that they were duped at all. I personally don't believe that Mary was a virgin. I do believe that the interpretation was as a maiden, and so when I came across that and thought through the process and studied it from that perspective, I then didn't feel that I needed to say, well, I better keep saying she's a virgin because that's what everyone says, and I'm going to be really looked upon as being a non-believer if I say, well, she was just a young girl. Why do you think
I'll just clarify, I do believe she was a virgin, but I'm just saying it's easy in hindsight to say that particular people applied bad sort of exegesis to
Yeah.
it. But prophecies are a weird thing that they tend to be fulfilled in a way people don't expect. So I think it's very easy with hindsight to say, well, they were wrong.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying, for me personally, when I suddenly thought, oh, hang on, they might have been looking at it a different way, I've come to a different conclusion. And so I'm happy to publicly say, I think she was a maiden. But within Adventism, if you come to certain different conclusions, there's a discomfort. So you, with this example, you've been able to go, well, I do still think she was the virgin birth. But there'd be a lot of Adventists that don't think that, but they would be a bit scared to say it. Does that play into a little bit of the problem here, where people are sometimes not saying exactly what they do believe for fear of ostracism, losing their job, all sorts of things? And I say that because you and I are in a similar position.
Yeah, I mean, the irony of Adventism is, as you know, we don't have a creed. So our pioneers didn't want a creed is like a formal religious test. So our beliefs are not meant to be, they're not meant to have the same hard edges that other denominations and versions of Christianity have. And the irony of going back to Glacier View is, I forget who it was, but it was a contemporary of Desmond Ford, said, you can believe virtually anything else in Adventism, you just can't challenge that founding myth about 1844.
Yeah.
And someone said to him, what's your views? And he said, well, I know what happens to people who express their views, so I won't keep my views. So I think in a lot of other issues, we have a wide spectrum of debate, which is really good. But on that particular issue, for some weird reason, it was, Desmond Ford basically had the wrath of the organisation, even though in terms of what's important in the minds of the hearers, it's actually not a big issue, as we discussed it.
Exactly. Yeah. This, like the church doesn't have the creed. It's got the 28 fundamentals, which can border on that if they weren't so. They've got a lawyer who's rewritten it, I think, and it's like an astrological sign. You can take it to mean whatever you want it to mean. But if you drill down into as you join the church and get baptized and you sign your baptismal certificate, there's some pretty creedal type things you're signing at that point. Do you think there's a danger?
Yeah, now it's become a de facto creed, even though it was not meant to be a creed.
Yeah.
But most of the fundamentals are broadly written, and I think going back to Glacier View, I think even when they first started as 27 in the Dallas statement, Desmond Ford even subscribed to all of them, including the one about the sanctuary. So they were written broadly enough that people could, and they were designed that way specifically so there can be that big tent Adventism. So I guess any move to make Adventism a smaller tent, I would strongly oppose, because I do believe in the that big tent concept.
Yeah, and Des was willing to go along with that Dallas, the 20-point document. So put with your theological hat on. Imagine you're back there as a young minister in Glacier View. Imagine you're there. And when I was interviewing Richard Coffin yesterday, he was saying that as they got news that Des was going to be fine with the 20-point consensus statement, they were feeling almost a sense of jubilation that things were going to be possibly going the right way, and they were getting excited about it. What do you think happened then? Why did Neil Wilson come in and encourage a handful of other scholars to come up with the 10-point doctrine? What's going on there? Is this the point where it shifts from theology to politics?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So if you that's almost more my law hat on.
Yeah. It's the converging of the two.
So I say a few things about the process from more a legal perspective. So the first thing I'll just say is at the beginning, Neil Wilson said it's not a trial of Desmond Ford, it's a trial of his ideas. And originally Desmond Ford wasn't even meant to speak at all. And part of that reason was with good intent. So it would be about his ideas, not his person. But clearly by the end, it became a trial of Desmond Ford. So that's a number one miscarriage of justice. You can't halfway, so you had the ground rules, and there's a legal concept called legitimate expectations. If you tell someone these are going to be the ground rules, you can't change the ground rules halfway through. In terms of what you're talking about, there were two major documents produced at Glacier View. One was the consensus document, that was the document that all the delegates basically worked on and voted upon. Desmond Ford affirmed that document. So by the action, so people say Glacier View, say found Desmond Ford talked heresy. Well, that's incorrect, because the document that the delegates of Glacier View prepared and voted upon, Desmond Ford agreed with that document. So he was actually in fundamental agreement with his brethren and the delegates. What you're referring to is Ted Wilson then had another document prepared called the 10-point statement, I think it is. You have to look at my notes.
Yes.
And that was produced by a selection of hand-picked scholars, one of which you've probably already spoken to, Norm Young.
Yeah.
They were not told what they were being. They thought they were just producing something of a bit of an explanatory memorandum or some other document that would aid, Ted Wilson to sort of draw out some of the stronger distinctions between Ford's views and other views. So the scholars involved in that process didn't even know what they were working on and why it was used. So that's an abusive process, the fact, and it was that document that was used essentially then to try and to effectively defrock and fire Desmond Ford. So there's a couple of legal things there. One is when you are, I guess the closest thing I'm a government lawyer, so my expertise is in government decision making. So when you make a decision, you have to obviously consider all the relevant considerations and you have to ignore all the irrelevant considerations. So the relevant consideration was the consensus document, because that was the document that everyone voted upon. And according to that document, Desmond Ford was in agreement with them all. The 10-point critique, sorry, it was 10-point critique. The 10-point critique was an irrelevant document. The delegates saw it but didn't get to vote upon it. It was produced and used for a purpose that those involved in drafting it weren't even aware of. Yeah. And it was that document that was used essentially to fire Desmond Ford. So,
yeah, and I'm not meaning to bring in your lawyer's hat too soon, because we were going to kind of define the two.
Sorry, go on.
No, not at all.
We're going to, you can kind of go both ways.
That's what I was going to say. I'm glad we're blending the two, because I don't think they can be separated. So tell us about then, if you are seeing this as a lawyer, and you were there, what would your assessment be of what Neil Wilson was doing?
So it would be, if this was like, say if I was at work, and the article I wrote for Spectrum, I kind of wrote it as if I was giving a legal advice. This is the sort of thing I give advice on every day of my life. I would say it was probably an unlawful decision, and which at law means it's no legal effect. And then how he was actually fired, because that was only Glacier View. You should not forget that then there was a separate process back in Australia.
Yeah.
That was also probably illegal. So his actual employment termination was probably unlawful.
Yeah.
Too late now, because there's a 6-year statute of limitation.
I was going to say, is it too late?
Just in terms of I think Gillian Ford has told me that at the time they did have the option of going and seeing some lawyers, and my view is they would have had a very good case to bring against the church. But Desmond Ford, being the bigger man, just accepted it essentially. But it was unlawful. And as we discussed before we started this, the great irony of it all is that this is all about a doctrine about God conducting a fair trial in heaven. And, the Calvinists will say, well, why does there need to be a trial in heaven? Because God already knows the answer. And the Adventist response will be, yeah, but God needs to show that it's fair.
Yeah.
When I've discussed this issue with Adventists, and I say, even if you hate Desmond Ford's theology, you have to agree with me it was an unfair trial. And they go, well, no, he was such a danger to the church, it was justified. The ends justifies the means. It's like, hang on, that's diametrically opposed to what the doctrine was all about.
That's the irony.
Defending at Glacier View. So,
oh dear.
So that's what I always say to people. You don't have to agree with Desmond Ford to agree that he deserves an apology. And I was really, when he died, or just before, when he's got quite sick, there would have been a good opportunity for the church to rectify that wrong. And again, they could have, Ted Wilson could have even affirmed that he theologically opposes Desmond Ford, but he could have shown some remorse for the process.
Mm.
Because it clearly was not a fair process by any measure. You know, and that's just reading it from a dispassionate lawyer's hat on. If I was giving advice.
And not only that, Gillian was saying, I think, on a comment during the Dr. Lynn Bartlett's interview just now, that not only that, that Neil Wilson hounded the leaders to get Des to even lose his membership.
The most hilarious thing out of the whole process is there was a correspondence where, so they come up with a consensus statement, Desmond Ford agrees to it. They come up with a Dallas statement, Desmond Ford agrees to it. They come up with a 10-point critique, which he doesn't wholly agree, but that's kind of what they've just adopted. Then there's letters back and forth between, I think, Parmenter and he was the division president in Australia, and
Keith.
And Ford, Dr. Ford. And then they say, it's words to the effect, every time they put the question to Desmond Ford, he agrees with them essentially. And then they say, they basically say, let me just bring it up actually.
Yeah.
3 seconds.
And if you could share any of these links and things later in the comments, would be great.
All right. So this is the best thing ever. So it's from a guy, Spangler, I forget who he is. He says, after going, yeah.
No. I was just going to say that, we've had lots of comments about Spangler.
All right. Well, this is the most hilarious thing I found out of the whole. And I say hilarious in a not in a funny, but
laugh or cry.
Yeah. It says, however, after carefully analysing Dr. Ford's responses and focusing on what they did not say, as well as what they did say, Praxit, that's the that's the General Conference Executive Committee, felt his position was not sufficiently positive. So they basically say to him, we're not going to condemn you for what you said. We're going to condemn you because even though you say things that we agree with, we think that you're not telling the truth or you're not saying it sufficiently. Oh. So basically they adopted the idea that they can read his mind.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's not, people say that Desmond Ford was Martin Luther. It's not even that. Or Galileo. Galileo recanted and then the papacy left him alone. Desmond Ford, again, there's this perception, he was to be a difficult person, or he was charismatic, or he compromised. He worked. That's my reading of it. He worked strongly to come up to agree with this consensus, which he did. And then they say, well, that's not good enough. And then they say, please agree to this, and he agrees, and they say, well, it's still not good enough. So
it's like you're being fired based on their assumed opinion of your intentions.
So basically they themselves adopted the position of psychics or prophets because they fired him for not what he said, but what they felt he felt,
So dig into those years post Glacier View here in Australia, where Keith Parmenter and his team are not only hell-bent on getting rid of Des, but they're wanting to remove all the young pastors who even say they agree with Des or they like Des. It became a time period where, if you're extrapolating on what you've just said, it's even crazier. It's because we're firing you based on what we believe Des was thinking in his mind. That then led to a dominoes effect of over 180 Australian ministers losing their jobs or leaving.
Well, it was 40. I think the new SDA Encyclopedia article on Glacier View, which is actually very surprised how honest and forthright it is. It mentions it was 40% of pastors left, and it's hilarious because it's people conducting these inquisitions. I wonder how many of them actually read the 991 pages. I bet not many. So that's the first thing. And secondly, based on, I suspect, what they think Desmond Ford said or taught and not what he did say or taught. And and then, for a position that essentially the delegates at Glacier View affirmed,
Yeah.
which is within the parameters of what is acceptable within Adventism. And even the 10-point critique that they used to fire, should you say this, even within the 10-point critique, which they used to fire Ford, doesn't call him a heretic. It just uses very soft language at times, saying, Desmond Ford doesn't necessarily agree with us. Well, that's quite different from saying, he was a heretic or his views are way out there. So again, and it all backfired on. This is the other irony. Going back to my original point, they saw Desmond Ford as the biggest danger to the foundation of Adventism, whereas they were just too stupid, no offense. They didn't realize he was providing the life raft. He wasn't the torpedo.
Yeah.
And it all backfired on them because it actually made people go to the other extreme. Once he was actually restraining influence to some extent.
Yeah.
If you adopt his 1980 position, I think people don't realize how moderate that position actually was.
Yeah.
It was a moderate position. Because the outcomes of Glacier View, that's why my generation doesn't know much about it, because it just became such a sore topic within Adventism. Let's just not discuss it.
Yes.
Because it's like, it's don't mention the war type of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So from the conservative viewpoint, I think it completely backfired on them. I think they thought they were saving Adventism. They actually imperiled Adventism. And to the extent they think that's an important doctrine, they imperiled it because now no one wants to discuss it.
Yeah. And
if you're a serious scholar or a pastor or whatever, you don't want to discuss it either because, of the potential ramifications.
Oh, yeah. Well, like I was saying before we went live, my generation literally birthed into this vacuum, and the only kind of disputes in the church were really your worship style. And I didn't really discover it until I read Ron Number's book, Prophetess on Health. And then I followed a little rabbit hole and started reading Bob Brinsmead's 1844 Re-Examined. And that's kind of what opened a lot of the can of worms for me. Maybe Bob was the torpedo and not Des. Do you think, though, that by doing that, because you're kind of saying, well, really, the church is adopting Des's 1980 version of righteousness by faith now anyway. You're aware, though, of Ted Wilson's compliance document, the trickle-down effect of unions being warned, reprimands coming soon, sanctions to follow. What gives you hope that the young people happily going along with this nice hippie Jesus kind of view of righteousness by faith is going to be kept safe?
So there's a number of different sort of points there. The first would be to say that so there's a whole sort of 1844, what's happening. It's very much linked to the righteousness by faith discussion, but that's slightly different. Even amongst conservatives, if you go to an ultra-conservative website like Fulcrum 7, I don't know if you've ever been there.
Oh, yeah, read all of that stuff.
Yeah. If you go there, they are ultra-conservatives, but they will still tell you they believe in righteousness by faith, salvation by grace through faith, not by works. You have to go to an ultra-conservative website like Advindicate, and to actually find someone who still believes in old school perfectionism. Now, I know Gillian, I've said this to Gillian Ford many times and she disagrees with me. She thinks that it's Adventism still not quite there in righteousness by faith, but I have hope that even conservative Adventists essentially adopt what Desmond Ford was, getting close to what Desmond Ford was trying to say in the Palmdale conference or whatever it was called.
1976.
Yeah, so I think he did, and even in the review, notice about his death, it admitted essentially his position has become the orthodox position on that issue.
Mm.
So I do have hope that perfectionism is unless you're in the ultra conservative extremes of the church, it's not as attractive. There's still legalistic elements, sure. But I have hope there.
But if you're the Ted Wilson and you're the president of the Adventist Church and you're hinting at last generation theology and the fact that our actions can actually influence the return of Jesus, that's not righteousness by faith, and that's the leader of the church.
With last generation theology, I think it's important to realise there's kind of different wings of that movement. If those people had said, we believe that the last generation on earth will be so loving and so caring and so kind that, you know, it's essentially replicates the New Testament, I wouldn't have such a problem with what they're saying. But they don't do that. They essentially promote a hard works legalistic view. And secondly, it's actually not last generation theology. If you actually get into their theology, they actually believe in every generation theology. So what they actually believe is, they believe every generation on earth
has the opportunity.
No, not even that. Every generation of Christian has to be perfect to the light they have to go to heaven. So so if God is known as sin, if there is a sin known to you in your life, you need to conquer that sin, or you will not go to heaven. And of course, that's ridiculous, because the simple answer to anyone who believes that view is, tell me when you reach perfection, and they won't be able to tell you.
Yeah.
But,
or even if you're having the angels and people from other planets watching on, when do they say this person has reached perfection? And they never will.
And, you know, Ellen White at the end of her life said, I haven't reached perfection. So did the Apostle Paul.
Yeah.
And said, I don't know anyone who has. But that's what they believe. It's actually, the last generation theology is even worse than it sounds. It's actually worse than Roman Catholicism. At least in Roman Catholicism, they believe that you're saved unless you commit a mortal sin. Last generation theology believes
any sin.
You're not saved if you've committed any sin.
Yeah.
I think Desmond Ford used to give an example of the person who doesn't sit straight or something like that. You know, you know, you know, do you enjoy that second piece of chocolate cake? You know, you committed the sin of gluttony, and therefore you don't go to heaven. I mean, if that's the test, you might as well just give up now.
Or had a cup of coffee. Yeah, but you're kind of saying that if, like, Ted Wilson leans to a little bit of that, hinting at it, but you're kind of saying that the righteous by faith thing will stand firm and the young people will see that through. I'm suggesting that that there's a threat for that to happen.
Oh, well, yeah, obviously there's these two wings of the Adventist church. I guess I was just saying that I have some hope, because even when I go to a conservative place like Fulcrum 7, at least most people still, like if you took Adventism 50 years ago or 100 years ago, the views on Fulcrum 7 about salvation would be considered progressive.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is we shouldn't actually underestimate how successful Desmond Ford was on that issue, even amongst conservative voices. To the extent that I've said this, I've asked more conservative voices, what's your view on salvation? And I'll often get, you're saved by grace through faith, not by works. You know, works are the fruit, not the cause of salvation. And I'll say, wow, you know, Desmond Ford preached that when the church was more conservative. And then I always get the same, well, no, he didn't. And it's like, yes, he did. Here is and then they you know, then they feel very uncomfortable with that idea, because everything associated with Desmond Ford is evil, and, you know, he's the Dark Lord.
Oh, yeah. Like I love in my interviews and discussions with Lloyd Grolleman, who he's a brother. I think he's great. I love jibing him and saying, your current view of the sanctuary would have gotten you fired in 1982. It's more in line with the Des Ford kind of sanctuary view.
I do think Desmond Ford, again, the war continues, but to a large extent he won that war, even though not there yet 100%, but largely he had such an impact within Adventism, even if it came at huge personal cost to him and Gillian and their family, and, you know, those 40% of pastors. So the whole story isn't just a sad story. I guess that's an important point to make, even though it did come at huge cost. Like, you can't underestimate the impact.
I've drilled down with Fulcrum 7 kind of people. In fact, my grandmother was very conservative, and she wouldn't have agreed with the Des Ford theology, and I'd drill her down on it, and she would say, I believe in righteousness by faith, not the works, but that when you have that grace of Jesus within you, you will, and this is where Des would agree, you naturally then, the fruits come out, and you end up not being you know, your Christian ethics, and you end up, I don't want to use the word sin, but you end up kind of doing the bad things less. The difference, so they do come to that. It's grace, but Jesus through you defends you in the court of heaven. You flow through and you start not sinning. And Des will talk about how the fruits will come out once you understand justification and the righteousness by faith. But the difference would be your Fulcrum 7 people will eventually say, but you will be judged eventually
Yeah.
on
So I
your
think
actions.
that this leads into an important point that Norman Young has pointed out, that Desmond Ford, it's important to emphasize Desmond Ford did believe in a pre-Advent judgment. So, you know, our doctrine is the pre-Advent investigator. Yes. So he believed in a pre-Advent judgment. So a lot of people malign him for denying that. He did believe that, but that's one of the misconceptions. You know, and that's a mainstream Christian belief. You know, in the creeds of Christianity talks about judgment. The pre-Advent judgment is called particular judgment in the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions. So it's a very mainstream belief. The bit that Desmond Ford had particular concerns with, as I understand it, was the investigative part. He didn't like the idea that, because if you've accepted Jesus, what's there to investigate? You've got no records. And everyone loves to hone in on a text passage in Great Controversy by Ellen White, who talks about, you know, God going through your records. But that passage is a bit hard to understand, because elsewhere she talks about, well, you've got a clean record in heaven today. So if you've got a clean record, what's there to investigate? I think how I understand it as a lawyer, this is the essence of the problem, I think, going to your grandma or Fulcrum 7 people.
Yeah.
There's a difference between a judgment and a trial. So I do believe in a pre-Advent judgment. I would question to what extent there's a pre-Advent investigative judgment. And the difference is people kind of don't understand the legal process either in today's world or the ancient world, or how courts worked in ancient times. If I sue you tomorrow, Peter, the first time we appear in court is not a hearing, it's not a trial. There's a bunch of interlocutory sort of stages. And when I used to do a lot of immigration work, people used to rock up to court for what's called the directions hearing, thinking it was a trial, and start arguing their case with the judge. Okay? And the judge would say, stop, this is not a trial, this is not the hearing, this is just an interlocutory sort of first stage. So how I would view it is, yes, there will be a judgment before the second coming, but it's not a trial. There's no going through Peter Dixon's records of good and bad, like, you know, Zeus with a scale. There is a judgment, but it's an interlocutory one. Desmond Ford talked about how, yes, there'll be some sort of judicial process, but it'll take a few seconds. I would agree in that, in the sense that there is a process in heaven, but there's no examination of your records, because what records are there to have? You've got a clean record in heaven.
And what's the judgment then? What is happening?
So it's an affirmation that you know, that you're worthy for heaven, so to speak. That's a mainstream Christian, it's not an Adventist view, that's a mainstream Christian view. Just go to the Catholic Encyclopedia and look up particular judgment, or, you know, Hebrews talks about you die and then there's judgment, and then there'll be the second coming. But you're not facing a trial where someone's going through. So you have faith. If you accept Jesus today, you've got a clean record in heaven. There's no trial of Peter Dixon. When we say there's a judgment, it doesn't mean there's necessarily a physical court with a physical judge.
No.
It could all just be metaphor.
Yeah, of course.
But obviously when you die, you know, heaven forbid if I die tomorrow, my fate is going to be sealed. And, you know, if I accept Jesus, there is an affirmation that I will be raised at the second coming, but there won't be a trial where that's where the legalists, that's where the conservatives within Adventists, they think there's an actual trial of Stephen Ferguson where every good deed and every bad deed, and that's why it's taken 176 years since 1844, because there's this long-standing process where they go through it all. But there can't be, because I don't have, there's no sins in heaven, because they're all being cleaned if I accept Jesus. And to use an analogy, I had a friend of mine who I used to work the Australian government solicitor, that's the Commonwealth governments, he was sued for $1 billion, okay, by a crazy, vexatious litigant, so a crazy person. And the crazy person filed us something like 3,000 or 4,000 pages of documents with the court, okay? Now, did I read those 3,000 or 4,000 pages? No. Did the judge read 3,000 or 4,000 pages? No, because this person was already what's called a vexatious litigant, which means they're actually barred by law, except with the leave of the court, to bring their action. So it never went to trial. There was never a hearing. I did have to go to court. I just stood up and said, Your Honour, this person's a vexatious litigant, and all that information's inadmissible evidence. And the judge just hit the hammer down. That was the end.
So the
and
judgment.
that's how I view judgment. That
Right.
Satan can try to bring up he's probably got a very big book of all Peter Dixon's sins and all Stephen Ferguson's sins, all irrelevant.
Yeah.
Because in terms of the official books in heaven, and this is all metaphor, it's empty. So there doesn't need to be a full trial of our sins versus our good deeds.
But you're saying that some people will go to that judgment and God will say you are a vexatious litigant and therefore you aren't coming into heaven.
No, so vexatious litigant would be Satan. Satan's the vexatious litigant because he's trying to bring the trial. If you don't accept Jesus, there will be a hearing, there will be a full trial, but it's not now. If you're a good Adventist, you believe that's what the 1,000 years in heaven's for. But in terms of the pre-Advent judgment, there is no trial there's nothing. What's there to try? What's there to go through?
So what happens to my good friend, the Tibetan monk, and he comes before the judgment? He doesn't believe Jesus is the only way. He's led a wonderful life.
Going into a slightly different. That's a slightly different topic of how we view that we get to heaven. I take a very open view. The Bible says in Romans 1 and 2, those who don't accept Jesus can still go to heaven, essentially. Jesus is the way, but, even if you don't know who Jesus is, heaven's still open to you. But I tend to view that salvation is something we opt out of. We don't have to opt into. So you must make a deliberate choice to reject salvation, not the other way around. I think we all think, and that's, again, the problem with the more legalistic viewpoint. We're always trying to do better because we think we have to somehow prove that we're good enough to go to heaven. And I think it's the opposite. You need to work hard to not go to heaven.
But you
God's
do.
not fine.
But if you're presented with Christianity and Jesus and you accept it, and then you later on go, hang on, I think there might be more than one way to heaven, not just Jesus. Are you saying that therefore you get to heaven and you won't go to heaven? You'll get this judgment that keeps you out of heaven?
Well, unless you're saying you believe in universalism, every single person goes to heaven. I'm very attracted to the idea of, I don't know if you've heard of universal legal justification theory, which is an Adventist view, based supposedly on what Jones or Wagner believed in the 1888 message, which is that salvation is given to every person on earth, but there's also free choice. But the free choice is to reject salvation, not the other way around.
But if I look at, I know we're slightly off tangent, but it's important, and I'm loving how you think. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions that are a little bit off the topic. If I say to my little 6 and 7 year old girls, you can, I will love you unless you decide, so you have to believe in me. No, it's not a good example, but Christ is saying to people, hey, it's your free choice. You can believe in me or not. If you believe in me, you'll come into heaven. It's your choice, though. But if you reject me, you're going to spend eternity in darkness or oblivion or whatever. That doesn't seem so fair to me.
Well, no, in my mind, it's not fair to think that God would force us to go to heaven. But just think of my view of salvation is simply this. Think of how you are as a father, right? And how you love your children, okay? You're an evil person. I'm an evil person. God is more loving than us. So, and I use the example of, I've given the sermon / written an article on Donald Trump as a good example of this. In Donald Trump's world, right, it's not based on merit. His kids help him run his empire and his presidency. They're not the most qualified people in the world. right? It's nepotism. There's nepotism to you, right? And he is an evil man, but even he knows how to love his children, as Hillary Clinton said, right? God is more loving than you. For you not to have a relationship with your daughters, what do you have? 2 daughters, did you say? For you not to have a relationship with your daughters, I suspect only one thing could happen. They would have to reject you. Maybe they would cut you off completely and refuse to talk to you. But there's no way from your perspective as their father that that's ever going to happen. So same with God. God is never going to reject us. It would take us to reject him. Now, what the line is for us rejecting him, it's not for me to judge or know. But if you look at all the parables of Jesus, God is never the one doing the rejecting. It's always God is the one who goes searching for the lost sheep and the lost coin. And with the prodigal son, it's the son who runs away, takes inheritance and leaves. It's not God leaving. So I think there's got to be free choice there, but it's got to be a free choice to reject God, not the other way around.
But it's a free choice that comes with it's your choice. But if you don't take that choice, I'm going to destroy you eventually forever.
No. So the thing is, for example, you don't have the opportunity to make the choice. Say if you're a child, right? So this is the difference. Catholics believe that the default is hell or limbo. That's why they have to baptize children, right, to get in. So I think it's the opposite. The first Adam condemned us all. The second Adam saved us all. So we're all saved. So if you don't have an opportunity to reject him, if you're not sure about whether you reject him, you're saved. And a good example of that is Job. Everyone loves the book of Job. They love to read chapters 1 and 2 and chapters 42. No one reads 39 chapters in the middle where Job complains about God and basically says he hates God. At the end of that chapter 42, the most important text, I can't remember, it's like verse 7 or something, Job actually says he repents. He repents about God and he repents that he challenged God, right? That's what everyone loves to read. The reality is, a guy called, I forget his name, Curtis, theologian, he wrote this seminal work saying in the book of Job, the punchline of the book of Job is that Job doesn't really repent. He gives a sarcastic repentance. He actually doesn't really like God, even at the end of the story. We like to think Job was very patient and he didn't curse God. No, that's the opposite of what the book of Job said. But you know what? God takes Job's, and the reason why it's written that way is in the Hebrew, it's deliberately ambiguous. So the reader is actually left not knowing if Job actually does repent. He could be sarcastic, he could reject God. But this is the key point. Even though Job gives an ambiguous, potentially sarcastic repentance, that's good enough for God. So God isn't looking for an excuse to reject Job. He's giving Job free choice. Even your weak, sarcastic, flawed faith is enough for God. He's looking for every excuse to let you into heaven, not as most Christians believe, and especially the perfectionists, that there's some sort of high standard that you need to work up to. But I mean, because the alternative to what I'm saying is complete universalism, which means that no one, and I don't believe that, because that would be that would leave us with no free choice. So I think there has to be free choice in there somewhere.
Or it gives you the ultimate choice. You're choosing your life without any threat.
Yeah, but you have to. So if you're saying complete universalism, if I don't want to go to heaven, if I do want to reject God, you're saying I don't have that choice. And I think that's for love to work, there has to be the opportunity of rejection. Even as a father, if your daughters say, I want nothing to do with you, right?
Yeah.
You kind of have to respect that decision.
But if I'm offering them a special reward after they die and they come to me and go, Dad, you are here and I rejected you, I say, come on in. That's all right.
Well, again, I guess we're going into a discussion about what it means to reject God. I don't think, and I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for atheists who say you shouldn't be motivated by some reward. That's not why. I mean, I think that's the essence of the book of Ecclesiastes. Solomon's actually questioning whether there actually is an afterlife or reward. And he says, I'm not going to do the right thing because I think there's a reward. I'm going to do, and because it helps my life be better,
Mm.
Doing the right thing often brings pain and suffering, but I'm going to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, and I mean that then brings you into discussions about human values based on groups of people agreeing what gives them a better sense of well-being and a better life. And the studies that show that you can actually come together with humans that don't believe in God and create value-driven societies, as long as there's an agreed-upon sense of what human well-being is.
Well, it's not for me to judge, but I suspect there'll be plenty of atheists in heaven, especially if their view was, I'm not going to be motivated by some sense of a reward.
Yeah.
I'm going to do it because, I'm going to live my life. And it's a good test. If you ever are wondering whether a decision is the right, Richard Dawkins said, and I agree with him on this, he said, all it takes, atheists can make bad decisions, but it's believers who make bad decisions thinking it's the right thing to do, essentially. Something to that effect.
Yeah.
And I think if a lot of times, if you're not sure if a decision is the right thing to do, you actually should ask yourself, if God didn't exist, would I still have done this? And I like to think all the choices in my life, or the big ones, even if it turns out God doesn't exist, I wouldn't have made a different decision.
Yeah, but then that therefore places you into the universalist situation, because you're not basing your decisions even on whether you will have heaven or not, or if there's love or not. You're basing it on being a good human, so surviving, connecting with other humans.
I mean, the other irony is you have to be careful that you also don't end up in your own brand of legalism then, as if its salvation is just through your works and actions. And then it's kind of this weird circle.
But
where
you can't fall into that if you say there's no salvation. There is only here and now and helpful, meaningful human connection.
That's true, but a lot of spiritual people do believe in, they sort of are agnostic, and then they'll say, well, God will just judge me on my life. And that's going back to our point of, well, at the end of your life, you're going to have some sort of trial or hearing where your life's going to be examined. I mean, and that goes, going back to Desmond Ford, that goes to the very essence against what righteousness by faith means. There is no trial. There is no examination. There are no record books that need to be. Yes, there may be some sort of literal, metaphorical, judicial process, but it's not an examination of the bad things of your life weighed against the good things of your life.
We've sidetracked, but I love that kind of sidetrack. I found that very stimulating. Thank you. And maybe we can have another interview down the track where we can explore that concept. I think it's a really important one to explore. And I enjoy chatting to you about this stuff because you've got the theology, spiritual side of your nature, but you understand the law as well, and that kind of helps you to articulate ideas and thoughts.
It can be good and bad.
Yeah, but it's a great way to be able to talk to someone from an analytical point of view that obviously has a heart for spiritual things as well. So let's look back at Glacier View and the Neil Wilson, you're perhaps suggesting, could see ahead that we need to get rid of Des because it may undermine Ellen White and all. You're saying that you think that righteous by faith is in good hands and is going to be nurtured throughout the church.
No, not in good hands. But I think I was just saying there's hope. It's not a hopeless situation. Because
it's a beautiful thing. There's nothing that can change a beautiful thing.
Even amongst conservatives, that's what I'm saying. Yes, there's forces. Yeah. There's forces certainly, and again, there's degrees here. So the big problem is actually people who say, I think this is the more realistic thing. There's people who say, I do believe in righteousness by grace through faith, where works are the fruit, not the cause of salvation. They'll say that mantra, and then 5 minutes later have the view, well, don't do X or you won't get into heaven, or they kind of like, I think a lot of Adventists compartmentalize these two different things and they kind of live almost in separate worlds inside their brain.
Yeah.
I think it's a lie we tell ourselves. I think we do say, yes, we're free. And I think the problem is, I actually think a lot of people have an abusive relationship with God, actually, when I think about it. So it's a marriage you know, when you get married, there's a legal concept and there's a relational concept. So if I have a fight with my wife today, right, doesn't matter how bad the fight is, if you go down to the registry office, it will still say that I'm married.
Yeah.
Okay, that legal status doesn't change.
Okay.
But in my relationship, of course, I have ups and downs, and I like to think I'm a better husband now than I was, I was when, the day after I got married. So, I think Desmond Ford talked about this too. Justification and sanctification are two tracks, separate tracks.
Yeah.
They're both vital, but it's careful to not confuse them. Obviously, the problem with Catholics and Catholics and more conservative Adventists is they mix them together as if I did something wrong, if I burnt the toast, my wife might leave me. And if someone you knew had that sort of relationship, you would say, well, they're in an abusive relationship. They need to get out of that marriage. They need to get out. That's abuse. That's not love. And I think a lot of people who view God like that, they actually have an abusive relationship with God. It's not.
Yeah, that's a good little analogy there, because that frames the judgment as being something that benefits us. It's like God saying, no, you did all these terrible, sinful, bad things, but because you formed this contract with me, you are still...
But see, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter it doesn't matter what fight I had with my wife.
No, that's what I'm saying.
If I fill out a government forms and it says you're married and put your wife's name, what I did today is not the question. It's a separate. It matters. And then people say, oh, well, you're saying that sanctification. They used to say this about Desmond Ford. You're saying sanctification isn't important. Of course, it's important. Just as being a good husband's important.
Yeah, you want a good, happy marriage.
Whether I'm married. Now, I do think it is, going back to my early thing about opting out of salvation. Yeah, I think it's possible to end a marriage, but it's actually quite hard. Like, it's harder than you think, legally at least. Sure, I could walk out the door tomorrow, and relationship would be a bit stuffed. But legally, to end it, it's actually a really hard thing to do.
You're kind of saying, and I think it's a good thing to say, that your understanding is that human faces the judgment. God just simply looks at the form. You've signed the marriage contract, and you come in. And you're saying that the other side, the more conservative, leaning to a perfectionistic kind of view, is saying they're at the judgment, and God's saying, right, here's your list of good things and bad things. Sorry, you can't come in. So you're saying because you've accepted this beautiful gift of the gospel, you've signed that contract, those other things aren't coming into play in the judgment.
Now, the only thing I would slightly deviate from that is some people look at like Romans chapter 1, where it talks about every work will come into judgment. I think we need to distinguish the notion of an examiner. Have you ever done jury duty?
No, I was invited once, but I ended up couldn't go.
So even in ancient Rome, or in ancient sort of systems of justice, again, they had the same sort of idea of an interlocutory thing where the case was thrown out. The actual examination at the first stage wasn't of the accused, it was actually of the jurors. That was the actual key examination.
Right.
And when you get examined as a juror, it's not the same sort of examination as a person in the dock.
No.
Okay, so it's actually, and in ancient Rome, for example, they did have an examination process, like a two-phase judgment, but the first phase was of a list of people who should be jurors. And these weren't random people, these were people of high esteem. And so when Paul talks, so to the extent, again, a lot of this could be metaphorical, but to the extent your works matter in judgment, it's not about you being the accused person in the dock. It's about you being a worthy person to participate in the next phase of judgment, to overlook those who perhaps didn't make it. So again, it's a completely different exercise to say, in terms of Peter, when Steve Ferguson dies, I accept Jesus. I'm not the accused in the dock. There is nothing to examine. There's a clean sheet of record. To the extent that the Bible suggests there is a judgment on my works, it's only relevant to the extent that as a saint who participates in judgment, remember Paul said you will be judging angels. It alludes to some sort of judgment process of the saints, but they're being judged as jurors, not as an accused, and that's a completely different type of exercise. It's basically me saying Peter Dixon is such a great guy, I'm going to list all his fantastic qualities. That's it. It. So, which, as opposed to the conservative view of judgment, Peter Dixon's good deeds versus bad deeds, and there's this entire hearing, and we're going to go through it all. And man, if you're an ultra-conservative Adventist who believes in last generation theology, if there's one unrepentant sin there, you don't make it.
Yeah. Where I probably not disagree with you, I think that's a great, fantastic encapsulation of the gospel in a really, really beautiful way. I think it's great, and I hope a lot of people listen to that part of the interview over and over again. I probably differ personally where I view the world as the place of judgment, where we draw closer to love, the fire, or we recede from that fire and it's darker. We have judgments between each other. The more bad things I do makes my life harder, makes life harder for other people. The realm of judgment is this realm of humanity, whereas I believe that you get to heaven and God goes, you have DNA, come on in. And that's where some may say, oh, you're a universalist, but I don't. There's lots of parts of universalism that I don't agree with, but just to be upfront about my own thoughts and beliefs, that's where I stand. But we're kind of looking at the Adventist viewpoint and how to...
I would say, there's a whole movement within Adventism, which is essentially opt-out universalism. That's essentially, so it's a version of universalism, but it does have a sort of opting out.
Yeah.
So it's not wholly Adventist to say that they even have your, whatever views you have. It's not. Yeah. I would just say it's not completely, it's not anti-Adventist to say that.
Yeah, that's right. And again, the thrust of everything I do is to converse and have interesting conversations with people that have divergent views, but to still go and say, hey, let's meet at the cafe later and have a nice burger together or something.
I think the problem with this whole discussion is the Bible's talking in sort of metaphors, and justification, that term that that's a legal term, and sanctification is actually sort of a priestly term. And there's a lot of jargon built into all of this. And part of the problem is when you actually discuss this with other people, sometimes they can use the same words but apply a different meaning. And 100%. You can actually agree with them in meaning, even though you disagree in the words. And the flip side, you could both believe the same sentence, but if you're using those words to apply different things.
Yeah.
So we can't, I try not to be even though I was describing what I believe.
Yeah.
Try to be not so dogmatic about it, because I'm not in heaven. I don't know.
Oh yeah. And that's coming across as well. Like we're analysing something and we're stepping back, observing and making comment on it, really. We're just being... I think
going back to what Desmond Ford said, and the apostolic principle about multiple fulfillments of prophecy, it's just a different way of... It's not, again, it's saying that let's just not be so arrogant about how prophetic fulfillment works.
Yeah.
You have to sort of open yourself up to... And my theory, Adventists believe in the second coming of Jesus. In Jesus' own day, who would have thought that John the Baptist was Elijah returned, for example?
Yeah.
I mean, it's those who have an arrogance about it that actually don't... There's Adventist people of the chart. They don't really read the Bible. They actually just have this elaborate chart of where everything's going to line up.
Yeah.
And I think that fed into the Glacier view, that type of Adventism. They saw Desmond Ford as a challenge to, not the Bible, but to their understanding of a chart based on random Ellen White quotes.
Yeah. It's a very arrogant position to hold. My father kind of taught me very, very young that, the more, the saying, I can't remember how it actually goes, but the more you know, the more you don't know. And I think that's a really interesting position to take, instead of a more of a judgmental kind of approach. So can you give of the two articles, and we've been blending and sidetracking and having a great conversation, can you kind of summarize your first article, which was about, and I think it was published in Spectrum?
So there's the theology one and the legal one.
And the legal one. Yeah, if you can give a little brief synopsis of the theology one, and then a synopsis of the other one.
The theology one is...
And later, can you share the links as well?
Okay. So the theology one is, what did Desmond Ford actually say in his 991-page manuscript in 1980 versus what did I think he say based on what I was told as a child and what people who probably didn't read the manuscript think he said. And the essence of why Desmond Ford, the essence of what I got out of his manuscript is that he said 1844 was a fulfillment of prophecy, not the fulfillment of prophecy, right? And linked to that, and that's based on the apostolic matic principle, which is that prophecies could have dual fulfillments. So in Matthew 24, when Jesus said, they said, what's going to be the sign of the end of the, second coming? And Jesus lists a whole bunch of events that clearly seems to point to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Most Christians, including Seventh-day Adventists, including Ellen White, also apply that prophecy as being having another application at the very end of time. And all throughout history, prophecies have probably had more than one fulfillment. So where Desmond Ford was again accused of letting the papacy off the hook because he said that the little horn was Antiochus Epiphanes. He didn't actually say that. He actually said Antiochus Epiphanes, the Greek king, was a fulfillment of the little horn. So was pagan Rome, so was the papacy, and so will another power be. But the essence of what Desmond Ford was essentially fired for was for teaching that 1844 was a fulfillment of Daniel 8:14, not the fulfillment. But my view is, theologically, eventually, when it's so much time has now passed that God clearly could not take that long to prepare, an end-time judgment, his view will actually become the sort of the neo-orthodoxy, because it's the only way that actually, far from condemn our pioneers, it actually is the one that saves them, because then you're left with a choice. They were complete idiots who couldn't read the Bible correctly, or something that just doesn't make any logical sense. And so Desmond Ford's view, I think, will actually save the church. You may well be dead, and I probably will be as well. Who knows? But it's the only one. His view will dominate. That's my prediction, because it's the only one that makes any sense to say that the pioneers read the prophecy. They were guided by God to read the prophecy in that way at that time, but it's not the only way you can read that prophecy.
I like that prediction. I think if you're an Adventist pastor and you were making that prediction that one day the church will be saved by Des Ford's teachings.
And again, that's his 1980 teachings. I'm not saying about what he said later years or what anyone else said. So that's the theology.
Yeah.
And then the essence of the legal thing was that for a process that was meant to be about a fair judgment in heaven, that was the doctrine that they were defending. They conducted an unfair trial of Desmond Ford at Glacier View. And using all my legal skills and powers and experience, there's so many things wrong with how that process worked, both in terms of Glacier View and then the subsequent defrocking and firing of employment. There's no way that was a fair process. Like, it's just crystal clear to me. And why he basically got fired because people didn't read his manuscript, one. And my only criticism of Desmond Ford, as we discussed before, is he probably approached Glacier View as a scholar. Okay, so he if you read his 991-page manuscript, it's all very methodical and logical and sets it out. Unfortunately, some of the good stuff is like at page 400. I would love to know how many of the delegates got to page 400. I suspect not that many of them. Okay, and they prejudged the matter. There were personality clashes. Now that's completely irrelevant. If I'm a judge in a court or a jury, if I'm a jury and I say, I really don't like the look of, Peter Dixon's on trial, I really don't like the look of him with those glasses. Yeah, that's not a fair trial. In fact, the Bible says in Exodus 23, says, "Do not favour a poor man in a lawsuit." Yeah, basically, it means you can't. You judge it on the facts before you. Yes, you can't bring out extraneous material. The fact that you don't like someone, or that person's really charismatic and they're popular, and you wish you were that popular, and you're jealous of them, that's not relevant. I think morally, even though they're outside of the 6-year, statute of limitations, I think morally, and would you agree, the church has... Absolutely. They need to apologise at the very least. I mean, morally, they should pay him some sort of restitution, or his estate, or to Gillian, his board. And I don't know if you know this about the story. It's in Milton Hook's book, and it's also mentioned in the Glacier View article. What actually happened is at the actual Joint Division Avondale meeting to fire him, Ken Eastman, who was the division lawyer at the time, who goes to my local church, he proposed an amendment that said he can only be fired if lawyers, external lawyers, went through it and made sure that Desmond Ford had not been denied natural justice, it had all been above the law. And the conference president was not very happy that Ken...
So when was that?
So this was after Glacier View, of course.
Yeah.
Then that was a theological thing, essentially.
Yeah.
Because his employment was held at Avondale College, they held a joint... Gillian or someone else can correct me, but they held a joint board meeting between the division executive and Avondale College's board with the idea of firing him. And at that meeting to fire him, the actual resolution of the board said that joint meeting said he can only be fired, his employment can only be terminated if external lawyers agreed that it had all been above board in terms of the legal process.
Whoa, so I didn't know that, and I've read Milton's book twice.
And according to Ken Eastman, so it's also in the encyclopedia article, according to Ken Eastman, as the division lawyer, he never saw that legal advice. Never saw it. So it's highly likely that board resolution, it's highly likely, I would bet maybe your life on it, but maybe not mine, that the advice said that Dr. Ford had been denied natural justice, and therefore the resolution of Avondale's board / division executive, the actual firing itself was not only just contrary to the wider legal principles, but was contrary to the actual motion passed. So therefore his employment probably was not terminated.
Well, doesn't that then adjust the statute of limitations?
No, because normally you only have 6 years to bring an action. So, for example, I would love to know if that law firm still exists or has its record. I'd love to know what that legal advice, because then we could piece together whether we'd know straight away, because we'd know in 2 seconds whether his employment was terminated lawfully or not, even in accordance with that resolution. But so, I mean, the division president could, Glenn Townend could, as the division president, write to that law firm tomorrow and ask if they still have a record, and we would know tomorrow what the answer is.
Maybe that's a little job you can do and report back to us.
So, but I suspect the church would just want to let old dogs lie. But that's how you would know.
But can't you do that? Can't you do that?
No, because legal advice is privileged to the client. So if you ask my legal opinion of something, I can't tell anyone in the whole world. It's like a priest. So because the division executive is the client, obviously only the division president only the division executive could ask for that legal advice.
So we could, all the members of this group and Voice and Now and others around the world, we could all write emails saying we would like to have that.
And it's probably, and the advice may well be on the church's own archive somewhere, not just the law firm. They'll have it on their archives, and you'd be able to piece together pretty quickly if it was lawful or not. And again, it's important to emphasise you can disagree with what Desmond Ford taught and believed.
Oh, yeah.
Completely irrelevant to the issue about whether he received a fair treatment. Because that is the essence of the pre-Advent investigative judgment doctrine. That God is not just fair, but is seen to be fair.
Amazing.
And they were not seen to be fair in how they dealt with Desmond Ford.
And possibly they weren't fair, and not only...
They weren't fair, and they were not seen.
They weren't fair, and they're not seen to be fair. Well, can you put together a document worded the right way, and we'll all cut and paste it into an email, and we'll find out where the best place to send it, and we'll bombard them with accountability emails.
So, yes, maybe, yeah.
Wow, there's been some really great insights today in what you've shared, and make sure you do put the links to both those articles below. I only had time to read the first one, the theological one, and I really loved it. And I love and I don't know if you call yourself a young person, but I do. I love that a young person is exploring these things, and
I guess it's important to say that. I didn't approach this with any, as I said at the beginning, and I wouldn't say I agree with every single thing Desmond Ford, and you can't subtile me, I just approached this as just a random person who grew up in the Adventist church, with the mythology of Desmond Ford, and I came to my own views about things, And again, you can read my 2 articles and not agree with any of Desmond Ford's views, but you have to agree that he was misjudged in what people say his theological views are, but weren't. And he was treated not correctly, very poorly in terms of the process.
Do you know much about the structure of the church in regards to the recent? They were going to have Des Ford Memorial Service
Yes.
at Avondale, and they moved it off campus. I was under the impression that originally they were saying, no, the SPD can't make its move because we have a separate kind of framework here that we're responsible for. How come they did get to move it?
I think they did the McDonald's trick. So, you know, a McDonald's store,
Tell me.
when you have a McDonald's, the McDonald's Corporation in America owns the land, and then the franchisee just operates the business on the land. So I think my understanding is the division or whatever, they own the land that Avondale College is on. So they use that as the basis by which they refused him. So that's how McDonald's controls its stores. It says if you don't cook a burger a certain way, you cannot operate your store on our land.
Soil. Well, wow, I'm so glad you've explained that, because when I tried to get Des Ford to speak a couple of years before he passed, I invited him to do a talk for us here in Kurrambong, as he'd done many times, not on Adventist soil, and I kind of pushed the boundaries. I said, no, I want it to be on Adventist soil, so I teed it up with the local Adventist school, Avondale, and he was going to speak in their music hall. And I was reassured by the admin there that, there's nothing they can do to stop us doing it. We have all sorts of secular things, other speakers, nothing they can do. But I then got a message from I think he was the conference president. I'm not hiding names, and he said it publicly and in emails as well. Des Ford is not to speak on Adventist soil, and now I get that McDonald's reference. That's why they use that word soil, Adventist soil. I thought they were just being smart, going, he's not going to speak on our land.
No, I think that's
but they legally meant it. They legally meant it, and the person that was kind of on the admin up there that was, reassuring me that it'd go ahead. He had to confess a week beforehand that I couldn't.
I mean, I do think, as I'm sure you did, it was deplorable at the last minute, how it all happened with the funeral.
Yeah.
And my understanding is, pressure from up high. I mean, that, again, Pilate showed more mercy, right, than our own leaders did. No offense, I don't want to be inflammatory here, but Pilate at least let, Joseph of Arimathea take Jesus' body and give it a proper burial. Pilate showed more grace and more mercy than we did, our own leaders did.
So they must have gotten pressure from the SPD to, like,
well, I think it was from, my understanding is, I mean, again, shouldn't really talk about rumour, but my understanding is it came from the very top, top, as you can see.
Well, if you're talking about McDonald's and the owner of the soil, the SPD owns the soil, not the conference, not the union. Is that correct?
I'm not sure. I wouldn't. Don't quote me on that, but I think it came from the very top in Washington, Silver Springs, Washington.
Wow.
And that would fit that sort of McDonald's analogy that,
Yeah, not on our soil. But there must have been agitation coming from...
Well, I think it was within Australia, obviously. The US wouldn't have even known about it. It was within their own... Mostly from people who haven't read the 991-page manuscript and have a certain mythology.
Yeah, that's right. And so they agitated and pulled strings, and then right at the top it came down. It's all very secretive and hush-hush. Adventism's this amazing... It's like this soap opera, isn't it? It's incredible.
But we do believe in a doctrine that talks about a public trial in heaven.
I know.
God makes so public to make sure that the angels and heavenly beings can see that God is not just, but is seen to be just.
And shouldn't Adventists...
It's all a fair and open, transparent process up in heaven, just not here down on earth.
And yet, if you're suggesting that is the heavenly way to be, then you should demonstrate that on earth to all the other denominations that are watching. Let's be transparent.
Exactly.
Let's be authentic. Oh, the irony. Mate, I've really loved our conversation today. Is there anything you'd like to add or share? I'm going to have to watch this 3 times over to
I
write
guess
down all the
the
gems.
only parting point is, the essence is not to judge without actually doing the research yourself. I think that's the lesson from Desmond Ford's whole and Glacier view. That's the main thing I got out of the whole process, that I just made assumptions that, that Gillian Ford, to her credit, challenged me on, and I read it for myself, and I came to my own, and again, I didn't believe everything that Desmond Ford believed and taught. A lot of the stuff I agree with what he meant, not necessarily what he, because words are ambiguous, but the essence was, do your own research. Don't just believe what other people tell you someone else believes.
Yeah.
And, that if you want to get something out of what the doctrine of the investigative judgment's about, it's that, not to judge a book by its cover.
And to read that book.
And to read the book. Or even be aware that the book exists. Helps as well.
And why do you think it's important? Like one of the first questions we talked about that I'm not sure we answered. Why is it important that young people read the book? And
well, this issue is at the, it links to our founding myth. You know what I mean? It's the Adventist, equivalent of tearing down statues of Confederate generals or, Abraham Lincoln. Like it links to, and that's why there was such reaction back in 1980, because it links to who we are as a people. But in a sense, it doesn't matter, I think, in some sense, because the doctrine isn't big. But in another sense, it matters a lot because it links to who we are.
Yeah. I certainly don't spend any loss of sleep thinking, have I understood this properly or have I not? My thing is, I want to be able to have people just to talk about it, whether it's important to some and others or not. Just talk about it. I think
to the extent that that Glacier view wasn't just about 1844, but it was also about righteousness by faith, and even where we see Ellen White in the process, it was extremely important and continues to be extremely important. But whether 1844 itself was a fulfillment of prophecy or the fulfillment, if you've got a hearing, if there is a hearing in heaven, as more conservative Adventists believe started in 1844, but you don't know what date your trial is going to be, and you're not going to be there. So what difference does it make? It's not. It doesn't. So I don't lose any sleep either. If my trial is tomorrow or next week or in a year or 50 years, doesn't make any difference. The key issue is about my assurance of salvation.
And look, and that in essence is what Des was trying to assess. Let's try and help people realize that they can be assured of their salvation.
Yeah, exactly. And because people view the idea of an investigative judgment as the trial of the saints, and didn't have that assurance of salvation, thinking that, like ancient pagans, their life was going to be examined with their good deeds versus the bad deeds.
Yeah.
And that's no way to live your life.
What do you think? I have trouble finding this in a document. I can read the Great Controversy, the chapter on investigative judgment, sanctuary, etc., and I'm in shock because that was the Adventism I was raised on, not by my parents, but just via osmosis and going to church and Sabbath school and school. I took on that whole time of trouble, probation closing, having to stand without an intercessor. It's very clear in the Great Controversy that at that time that's what Ellen White thought. And people tell me that it's shifted and changed, and now there's a nicer view of the sanctuary and investigative judgment. And I read the 28 fundamentals and I go, what? This is very, like you say, very broad. What do you think the current church officially does believe on the sanctuary and investigative judgment, and where can I go to find that?
Well, first, I guess, as we said right at the beginning, Adventism is a very broad movement. We actually like to say we're a movement, not a church. Apart from the 20, that you can't remember what number fundamental it is, I guess isn't an official view, which is a good thing.
But wouldn't you say that if you're an evangelist, you bring people into Adventism, and they go and read the Great Controversy, which is a sanctioned book, still published and highly regarded by the Adventist administration from on high, they can open it up and go, "Oh my goodness, am I supposed to believe this?"
I mean, in defence of Ellen White, I mean, when I did my degree at the Anglican seminary and learnt about all the, say, supposed contradictions in the scriptures, I actually was quite fine with that, because I'd already lived through the Ellen White's a plagiarist, and she's she contradicts herself. I mean, she herself had said, the famous statement, "God's with the penman, not in the pen." She's living in her own cultural context. She's trying to she's having it. I do believe that she had visions from God, but there's a very big difference between the vision and what the words that end up on the page. I mean, she had a whole team of editors help her write.
Yeah.
And God didn't select the words for her. But to be fair to her, the Bible is full, I don't want to destroy anyone's faith, but the Bible is full of similar examples where Gospel of Matthew says a centurion visited Jesus, but Gospel of Luke says, no, a centurion sent Jewish elders to visit Jesus. Well, which was it? Or Matthew says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Luke says, no, blessed are the poor. Or which is it? Is there a contradiction? I don't think necessarily, but
I think there's a big contradiction between Great Controversy book, chapter on the investigative of judgment, and what Adventists would generally say is the sanctuary now. I think it's very contradictory. It's not just a difference of a poor person or a missing out a different name. It's
well, yeah.
Like it's.
I mean, I don't want to go too down the rabbit hole, but again, back to my Matrix analogy. In the Matrix, where Neo sees the Oracle and she says, kind of think of Ellen White like the Oracle. That's how I explain it to non-Adventists. And in that community, like Morpheus was a hardcore believer, but then there was others in that community who kind of really didn't believe in her. And then Neo went and saw her, and she goes, "You know what? You're not the one." Now, actually, he was the one, but she told him what he needed to hear at that particular time. I kind of view Ellen White a bit like that as a non-canonical prophet. She has a particular message at a particular time.
But surely, if God on high is giving this prophetic vision, I can understand her taking that on board and slightly getting it wrong. But to say that Jesus, initially, the shut door, initially she's saying, only those who have accepted the William Miller view, we've got to be perfect and good and keep the commandments because any day he's coming back. Quick, don't sin, let's do this. That's clearly a dangerous kind of, I feel like couldn't God have been a little bit more clear in...
Well, look. Again, I don't want to be too faith destroying to your listeners, but I'll give you an example of what seems to be an error. In Mark 2:26, it says that it was Abiathar who was the high priest when David ate the priestly bread. But if you actually go to 1 Samuel 21:1-6, it wasn't Abiathar, it was Melech. So
does that change the gist of the message?
No, exactly.
Yeah, but with Ellen White, I'm suggesting that it shifts from Christ not being your intercessor, probation closing, the time of trouble, the way she talked about it. 1 in 20 young people are going to, reach heaven. The narrative was such a different thing to then just a different perspective, and we just didn't interpret that quite right. Man, you read that Great Controversy, it's very clear that you had to shift that so far from what it's saying, not just a different person saying it. I just don't know how she could have written that and misinterpreted it from a vision from God.
Good question, Peter. Good question. I don't believe I've got some absolute answer to that, but again, I would just refer to my earlier comments where I do believe she had visions. I don't think she was a fraud in the same way as Joseph Smith. I think he just literally made up where said Missouri was the Garden of Eden, and but yes. when she's more precise in particular, that definitely is more of a problem if she's precise in one point. So in that great controversy quote, she talks about the thing that's more worrying to this discussion. She talks about, examination of records, and basically sort of suggesting you better have it all together because you're not going to make it. Even though in other passages, she clearly says, you don't need to worry, your record in heaven's clean. So, well, it seems to be a clear contradiction. So,
and it's that contradiction, not mild adjustment. It's a changing of the very principle of what she said. You can't just.
But again, the Bible.
But again,
the Bible is.
Same.
But again, the Bible is full of.
Where in the Bible would you find somewhere where you might be able to note a different person, but where the principle has been changed?
Well, again, you might not say it's a different principle, but when Matthew says it's blessed are the poor in spirit, and Luke says it's blessed is the poor, they actually are very different things. One is about the spirituality of the person. The other is about the actual physical needs of the person. Or in the Old Testament, I don't want to get into too much, but you heard of JDP? Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
JD? Yeah, so and I'm completely comfortable with that idea. It's the idea that the law of Moses, the Old Testament, is actually a compilation of two earlier texts that were sort of cut and pasted together. And I'm completely comfortable with that idea. If you actually go and read the two stories, they're actually they're kind of the same story, but like written by two very different groups of people, or three or four groups of people. So, in the Exodus account, one is a very sort of, it's all almost the Gods of Egypt movie style, where it's all just natural explanations and God isn't really intervening. And the other one is, no, God is very much intervening and he's an actual personal God. And, they really are walking through, the Red Sea with, a supernatural miracle. I don't know, you might think that's not a contradiction, or you might just think that's a different
perspective. I view those as different perspectives. I don't view Ellen White's as different perspectives, or us misunderstanding what she said, or her later on going, oh, hang on, I misinterpreted that. I view them as contradictions, polar opposite. And I wonder, how can God give someone information that's polar opposite? When I look at, she had the vision that Jupiter had only 7 moons or something like that, and Joseph Smith was like, wow, that's confirmed she's a prophet. I get that contradiction because he needed to be convinced.
That was the Neo example, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
She told him what he needed to hear at that time.
Yeah. Now, what she should have done, and what God, here's me saying what God could have done, is she could have written in a separate document that said, this is not to be opened until after I'm dead. I truly believe there are, however many moons there actually are, so that future generations will know that I was telling Joseph what he needed to hear, and I do know from God telling me exactly a prophetic thing.
Well, look, again, even in the Bible, things aren't clear. Otherwise, we wouldn't have 20,000 denominations. The classic, Paul, you're saved by grace.
James,
not by work. James, you're saved by grace and works. Or Paul himself saying in Romans 1, you're saved by your works. Essentially,
but to me, that's a constant, normal human thing. It's not a contradiction. I love playing guitar. Because I love it, I put time into it. When I used to be a music teacher, you can guarantee to lose pupils by saying, you must practice half an hour a day. I want your parents to sign off on this. They droves. When I started saying, hey, just love it, play 2 minutes 3 times a week, I didn't have any people leave, and the kids were pouring their time into becoming better musicians. So this constant theme of loving something and putting work into it is a human condition. I'm suggesting, and maybe it's for another podcast, that that hers weren't just normal interweaving paradigm shifts that we naturally talk about as humans. They were really genuine, massive contradictions.
I don't know, Peter, because again, there's lots of New Testament and Old Testament examples. The Acts, how Luke records the events of the Council at Jerusalem in Acts 15. Paul in Galatians seems to suggest it was a very different outcome. Or Paul saying, in Galatians 3:28, you're all equal, male, females are relevant, and then telling women to be silent in church.
Yeah,
There's a lot of
true.
things that
That's
are
a good one.
challenging. There's a lot of things. The big mistake of Ellen White, if there is another Adventist prophet ever to come along, my advice to them, if they ever read the podcast, is perhaps to shut up and don't speak so much. The problem with Ellen White is she lived at the dawn of the modern era,
Yeah.
where it was easy to disseminate, to publish things, and then she just went nuts.
Yeah.
And look, going back to what Desmond Ford thought of Ellen White, I would subscribe to that view, essentially, that she was pastoral. She was primarily pastoral. She wasn't meant to be the basis of sort of exegesis of texts in some. That's how I view her, and I'm comfortable with viewing her in that light.
Yeah.
So I don't, Adventists have turned her into the Adventist Talmud, where they don't need to read the Bible anymore, the primary source, because they can just go through the secondary source.
Yes. Yeah. I like that, and I like what you said about Paul. That's an example of a contradiction. I hadn't thought about that.
I think part of you just have to live with the contradiction in a way.
Oh yeah, and again, in my life, I'm 100% happy with that. I'm only exploring the idea of people that seem to not be happy with that, but are accepting it anyway.
I think the fascinating thing about Ellen White is because she lived so long and she wrote so much.
Yeah.
A lot of the things that we take for granted with the Bible itself, even, we actually see. So, for example, you were talking about JDEP. We actually see that in Ellen White's work. The Ellen White estate cuts together different things and puts them in compilations. Like Last Day Events, it's like, if it's a compilation of different statements, it's like, well, no, she never wrote it as, that's what's happening with the history of the Bible. It's just that we see that before our own eyes. So I try to look at her. So the irony of me doing my studies at the Anglican seminary is I actually was less judgmental of her coming out of the end of that process. She was certainly off her pedestal, but I realized not to judge her more harshly than scholars judge, biblical authors.
And then you can actually quite enjoy it. I actually read Steps to Christ a few days ago. I don't know where I didn't get the time to read your second article, but I read Steps to Christ. Mainly because
I think the key thing with Ellen White is my other thing is she was best as a reactive figure, not a proactive figure. So she wasn't best at coming up with doctrines of the church. Others were doing that. And the irony of Ellen White is, for those who think we're a cult for having Ellen White, we would definitely have been a cult without Ellen White, because she helped us be Trinitarian and the righteousness by faith. Now, look, was she perfect in that? No, but she was trying to softly with her own fellow pioneers, some who were hardcore Arians and some were hardcore legalists. Herself in her earlier years, she evolved. Yeah. So I think Adventism does owe her gratitude.
Yeah.
But again, I don't put her on a pedestal.
No. And when I read this the other night, and it was in relation to another separate podcast that I do, I was able to just enjoy it. Instead of reading it going, what's she saying here? For the first time in my life, I just read it and thought, boy, that was...
Again, the irony is Desmond Ford, that was one of the key planks. He was supposedly attacking Ellen White. Well, he only adopted the position she herself said, in quite a few, more than one, place, that she wasn't to be the test.
Yeah.
And so, it's it goes to the judging, how you judge someone. It's like, if I took anything out of this, you should judge people by their own, professed standards, not sort of moving of goalposts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, imagine if the mantle of messenger and prophet was put on you and I, and all the things we've written and talked about and posted on Facebook were analysed.
Exactly.
Okay, three quick things before we wrap it up, because I've got you here, and I, as I've said, I appreciate you taking the time. And again, once Glacier View is over, of course, we've already been going a year. This is only 5 weeks or 7 weeks now of Glacier View. We're going to be delving into other interesting topics and keep on going. I'm fascinated by it. So I want to invite you back. Hopefully you'll say yes down the track. So just three quick things. Women's ordination with your legal hat on and your theologian's hat
I
on.
wrote another article on this because I actually read all 1,000 pages of the TOSC, which I don't think anyone else read, either of the 2,000 delegates. And obviously I'm naturally inclined to the pro-ordination viewpoint. But I think everyone got it wrong because everyone asked the wrong question. And the wrong question is, the fundamental problem is reading both sides. Well, there's actually three sides of this story, but all three sides, they all assumed a bunch of things. Like there's no definition section where anyone discussed basic definitions. And the essence of the problem is everyone assumed that the office of elder is the same as the office of, what we would consider someone to be a member of the clergy. So we've got it all backwards in Adventism. We allow women to be elders, but we don't allow women to be pastors, or ordained pastors. It should be the opposite. If you want to make a case for gender discrimination, and I'm not saying I do support that, but if you were to accept the conservative viewpoint, the most it should mean is your local church can decide that it can only have male elders, but it's got absolutely no right to say that their pastor, their clergyman, can't be a woman.
Interesting.
Yeah. I think we have it all backwards, the debate.
So, is there grounds for women then to take legal action?
No, because it's a wholly theological. But I think in terms of, I think the problem is, even if you subscribe to the view that, well, God speaks through the General Conference session, I don't think it's actually the win that Conservatives think it is. It just meant that we asked twice in a row the same dumb question. We didn't actually ask the right question. We've got it all backwards.
Interesting.
So, yeah, because there's kind of the New Testament uses terms that are very fuzzy and flexible, and that's why everyone's getting confused. But there's essentially a charismatic, spirit-filled leadership, and then there's an appointed leadership. The reason why men perhaps should only be appointed leadership in some cultural contexts is because they were the ones that have to deal with the local Roman authorities. If you're going to have someone dealing with the local Roman authorities, you have the respected person that culture accepts. But in terms of who God chooses to lead spiritually, it can be, it's not for man to decide. And it's the difference between how the seven were selected, they were elected, versus Matthias. Remember, he was chosen by lot?
Yes.
God decides alone who can essentially be what we would consider a member of the clergy. The word clergy comes from the Greek concept of being chosen by lots, which goes back to how Matthias was chosen.
Yeah.
Matthias was never ordained, by the way. He and the other candidate were prayed on before they cast the lots. They cast the lot, and then he automatically was the 13th apostle, essentially, or the replacement 12th apostle. So, and ironically, like Paul was ordained, but the only reason they ordained Paul is because they weren't sure of his authority as an apostle. So by saying women shouldn't be ordained, all they're actually saying is that their office is so certain that we actually don't need to go the extra step. They're the Matthias, they're not Paul. But, that's my take on women's ordination. Put it all backwards.
Yeah, I like it. Okay, compliance document.
What I find bizarre about the compliance issue about women's ordination is I can get the American.
Have you read the 5 or 6 points on the compliance document?
I have. It was a while ago, but what I don't get is I fully support the European unions where they're like, hang on, we're obeying the vote. The vote, because my understanding is that the European unions are not ordaining men.
No, they're just commissioning everybody.
That is the Christian way to do it.
Yeah.
They are obeying the vote. The vote said they cannot ordain men. Fine, they're not ordaining men. They're commissioning women, and I think they raised that. They're like, hang on, why are you're punishing us for obeying the vote?
Yeah, Ted threw it back at them with the same kind of. Well, I don't think it carries a positive kind of view. A little bit like the assessing what someone's thinking.
Yeah, it's the psychic. It's the psychic. Of life, that's right. Yeah.
So if you were up at the microphone there when Ted was saying that, what would you have said back to him?
Well, in defence of the European ones, I would have said it makes no sense because they're complying. You've got no authority to to punish them essentially for obeying the vote. You know, we talk about the GC in session is the highest authority of the church. Fair enough, they're obeying that. You can't punish them for obeying the vote just because they're implementing that decision in a way you don't like. Well, that's too bad. That's why unions exist. That's why the church set up unions.
Yeah. And yet they were warned, and 2 of the 6 were about to be reprimanded, but that was voted down to a warning. And they have to then present another case in defence if they don't comply and start ordaining men and only commissioning women very soon. So it has happened. Even though it's silly, and surely that's going to have a trickle-down effect as time goes by.
I mean, yeah, you can respect people when they have a different point of view from you. It's hard to respect people when their view just doesn't make any logical within their own. This is again basic view, same deal.
Yeah.
Like if you disagree with someone, but according to their own internal logic, it makes sense. You can kind of respect that.
Yes.
But it's when their view doesn't even conform to their own internal logic.
That's what frustrates
kind of drives you nuts.
Yeah, that's what frustrates me. Yeah, I can totally get when someone goes, you know what? I'm an Adventist. I believe this, and this, and I live within that paradigm, and the cognitive dissonance doesn't worry me. Fine, but it's when there's a cognitive dissonance within a cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. Yeah.
So last quick thing, and this is bound to be another podcast. Connie Berenhausen, the publishers, back in Ellen White's day, threatened legal action if Ellen White didn't stop selling or I think she was already selling them, her book on Paul, The Life of Paul, because it was very, very similar to theirs. Heading titles were the same, a lot of the same pictures used in there were the same. Some people defend the plagiarism by saying, well, there's different times and copyright was different back then. But if she complied to that, she took the book off the shelves, responded to their threat of legal action. What are your thoughts on that?
Even if you accept that she had visions from God, that doesn't make her a perfect person. And I suspect some of the things that she did was not, we would say, moral. And, you know, people say the same thing about the New Testament. You probably heard the argument that certain letters of Paul were not actually from Paul.
Yeah.
They were from the Pauline. They weren't frauds per se, because they were kind of from the Pauline school of thought, you could say.
Yeah.
And they say, the same argument, they say it was a different time back then. No, it was still fraud and plagiarism back then as well. But you look, I don't think I need to defend Ellen White's plagiarism. I do think even if you accept that she plagiarised, my own cognitive dissonance, probably you'd say that, again, I can accept her prophethood to some extent. But, it doesn't mean that I'm going to accept every little word that she wrote, especially, I don't know, is this a PG discussion or
I think all the adults are watching.
I mean, because nothing, that's a good example, but there's nothing more hilarious than her views that masturbation causes cancer.
Oh yeah, there's been actual big conversations in one
of our...
You know what I mean?
And then if you go to the E.G. White estate and they go down the rabbit hole trying to defend it by saying, you know, loss of zinc and all sorts, look, guys, you're just gone too far there. Just rule a line under it and say she was probably wrong.
Yeah, the solitary vice.
You know, so there's a lot. I take Ellen White with the mixed bag.
That kind of thing, I can go, well, that was just her time, and everyone was saying that. But the plagiarism one, doesn't that kind of cast a bit of suspicion on her integrity?
Oh, absolutely. And again, you know, I'm not saying she was necessarily. I saw in one of your previous podcasts, you talked about she was against kingly power when she was not in power, but when she was in power, then she was all for king power. So, that, I mean, again, I try not to judge her more harshly than. I mean, and if you compare her even to the Protestant reformers, Martin Luther and John Calvin were massive anti-Semites who called.
I literally was about to say that
Judaism and, but. Does that mean Martin Luther's take on righteousness by faith through grace is wrong? No, of course not.
No,
and I think he was a prophet as well.
Yeah.
He was, John Wesley was a prophet. He had visions, but he was a perfectionist, which we would rightly see as legalism
Yeah.
today. They're all mixed bags, these figures.
And when you read Luther's book, which is called, I won't say what the title is, but which has been allegedly labelled as anti-Semitic, once you look at it from the time that he was writing it in, you don't condone his writing of it, but you understand his frustrations of the system that was in play at the time. He really was criticising the system more than the people.
Yeah, but I mean,
when you read the book.
Yeah, but I mean, he also said, Luther also basically gave the moral backing to the German princes to suppress what was called the Peasants' War, where 300,000 people were murdered. So that guy was a mixed bag, but we couldn't have had the Protestant Reformation without him.
So he'll get to heaven and God will say, yep, you have DNA, come on in.
Exactly. So, I mean, Nazi Germany probably owes its moral to him because of his separation of church and state, because he pushed it a little bit too hard, some argue. That the church said, well, that's a political matter, we don't intervene.
Yeah.
So, Ellen White, I try not to judge her cheese-hating plagiarism with the anti-Semitism of her predecessors, or
yeah.
the genocide. I mean, we just go back to the Old Testament.
Yeah.
God supposedly saying, murder all the men, women, and children. It's hard.
And all the animals.
And the animals, just don't even let them. Saul being punished essentially for trying to save some of the animals to sacrifice to God.
Yeah.
And it's pretty harsh to me. So
Japheth, the king that was promised, if you let me defeat my enemies today, I'll sacrifice the first living creature I see when I get home. And his daughter walks out the door, and he sacrifices her.
Yeah, he killed his daughter. That's right, exactly.
My view is that those stories are either metaphors, they happened and God is a terrible God, or they didn't happen, and that's just written by Bronze Age kind of storytellers. So in that case, when you read that story again as a metaphor for the time period, the sacrifice of his little girl is not so much an actual sacrifice of a little girl, it's the sacrifice that he had to make to achieve the desired outcomes, how special to him they were to make those sacrifices. Anyway, that's just another... that's how I personally like to interpret things that seem incongruous to me. They're either written by the Bronze Age guys that didn't know what they were talking about.
I mean, going back to Ellen White, I guess all I would say is, yes, there's lots of problems, but the people who throw the stones, especially from outside Adventism, tend to live in glass houses if you go into their own history. They're always founded by a prophet or prophetic-like figure who has a lot of problems themselves.
Yeah, I think be very careful making judgments of anyone, really.
It's low-hanging fruit to our detractors.
Yeah.
And Adventism is more than Ellen White. That's the other thing.
Yeah, I think in closing, Kenneth Samples, when I interviewed him, and he was a protege of Walter Martin, and Walter Martin was very much behind the questions on doctrine, and he said that his view of it's a good one, a really interesting interview. He said that Des portrayed the gospel and the teachings of Jesus in a way that he'd never seen articulated from any other Christian writer. And I thought, wow, that's high praise indeed. And if you look at that, and then that funnels your own narrative into what was Jesus teaching. Don't think of anything else, but just the things he was teaching. They were revolutionary ideas that apply to all time. And if you can somehow grasp that, in spite of all the flaws that we have as humans, you become less judgmental. You become more loving, and you become more like, you know what, there, but for the grace of God go I.
Yeah.
You and I might disagree on stuff, but hey, we've had a good conversation. And
I'd just like to finish by saying, again, Desmond Ford, it was a lot of personal cost to him and his family. And even if you don't agree with everything he said, but Adventism does owe a huge legacy to him, and
Mm.
his views, especially on righteousness by faith. I do think he has won the war, and that will show in the long term. And even some of his other views about 1844 and how we apply, apply prophecy, what he wrote back in 1980, I swear, I'm of the strong view that will eventually, I have optimism that eventually will be, that'll essentially
Yeah.
become the mainstream position, because it's the only one that makes sense to me as to actually how to preserve Adventism, not to torpedo it.
It might be 400 years like Galileo.
400 years and we'll be long gone. But look, someone might one day dig up this podcast. And,
And they'll go, Stephen Ferguson must have been a prophet. Let's look at all his life works. Oh, mate, it's been so good chatting with you.
Very good.
And I really appreciate your time. And man, you've really shared some great insights today. Thank you so much.
No worries, excellent.
Everyone that's watching, just before I hang up, don't forget we're interviewing George Knight tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. I think it's going to be. And yeah, I should get you in on the conversation, Stephen. You'd be able to ask way more erudite and articulate questions than I'll be
You're
able
doing a very
to.
good job, Peter. By the way, just to affirm you, this is quite a big. Obviously, this is a big undertaking that you've taken on, and
Thank you, Steve.
I feel very honoured that amongst the illustrious guests, you just chose little old me to have a say. Because I'm not, I'm just a lay person who just took the time to read the document. That's it. That's my only claim to any input here.
But I tell you what, I'm so glad you did, and I'm so glad you're here, and you are a valued part of this group and of this resource. So, Stephen Ferguson, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we're back. Wow. So those listening on the podcast, this is now back to 2025. You were just listening to Stephen Ferguson from season 2, episode 30, and that was 5 years ago. Wow, I've got so many thoughts. I might leave them to you guys in the comments. I think Angela asked a question. Is this guy still an SDA? I just wrote to him just then. He's been sending me some messages during the program. So I've just asked him that. So maybe we'll hear back from him before we say farewell, and I can let you know. But what really strikes me is I've changed a bit in the last 5 years. I'm still supportive of progressive Adventists who want to find the gem of Adventism, and Stephen said there that he thinks that at some point the Des Ford gospel of the early 80s, late 70s will stand and will become the dominant doctrine within Adventism. Even 5 years ago, I was starting to doubt that would ever happen. And now I would say 99% certain that the new theology of Des Ford and the many who have similar theological views to Des, they will never, ever become the mainstream view of Adventism. At the core of Adventism is Ellen White's authority, and no matter how many times she said, "Oh, I'm just a messenger, not a prophet," or "Go to the Bible, and if the Bible is in disagreement with my views, go with the Bible," no matter how many times you say that, or she said it, or you claim it as a reason that we can talk about the biblical version of Adventism, the church itself does not adopt that approach. It never has, and it never will. because at the DNA, the structure, the pillars, if you remove Ellen White, the church cannot stand. If you even water down her authority on those original visions, the church cannot stand. And here's why I think it's different to Luther and Wesley and the other flawed humans that may have had incredible influence in creating change and positive movements. Though they were flawed, Ellen's flaws are more often linked with God told me. Luther and Wesley may claim that they were being led, inspired by God to question, to create new movements. But Ellen White clearly claims that her visions support the notion that Jesus will return soon, and that return is even dependent on the behavior of those on the planet. The more closely they follow the commandments, the more likely Christ will return soon. So this special message of Adventism, where God is to be vindicated, the atonement is an ongoing event, not just a once and for all at the cross. This ongoing concept of a pre-Advent judgment, all wrapped into the investigative judgment, into the sanctuary doctrine, into some of these key pillars, are so unique, and the claim is so large that we have the Adventist claim we have a special message that as soon as you add a Des Ford theology, or a Steve Ferguson, or a George Knight, or a Gil Valentine, or any of these guys that are progressive Adventists who have eternal hope that it's going to change, and a belief that their version of Adventism nestles in with traditional Adventism, have either been duped, are deluded, are disingenuous, or dishonest. I can't see any time that Adventism will be largely embracing the new theology. And I wonder if you're watching this now in 2045 instead of 2025, in 20 years' time, if you're watching this, I'll be in the retirement village by then, maybe, or swimming in the nice pools and beaches nearby, relaxing, enjoying cafe culture. But I wonder if the progressive Adventists will still be as positive of claiming their unique Adventism in the demonstrable light of how that has never happened. Progressive Adventism has never gained a foothold, and whenever people have tried, it has been suppressed, marginalized, squashed, cancelled, destroyed. I watched the recent, and I'm going to do a show on it maybe next week, and I'd love to hold up the book that I always hold up, the Reclaiming the Prophet guys. They did a panel discussion last week, and it goes for a couple of hours. And I was so torn because I really value these guys and what they have to say and how they've really helped me over the years see Ellen White for what she is, a person. But to me, a person that made false claims. She might have believed her false claims, but then she tried to correct them and twist them and adjust them. And she couldn't just say, boy, I was totally wrong on that one. I don't know what I was thinking that night. I really thought God told me this, but it turns out he didn't. And I watched these guys claiming, most of them, to be approaching this from a historical perspective. We are historians, the claim was made. But then for them to inject the Adventist apologist vibe in there, where they're defending her. And, she was wonderful with pastoral care, and she was such an inspiring woman. And I see the Adventist conundrum as being very different to the Protestant conundrum, where there are different high and low and fundamental and liberal factions in different denominations, and they work it through. But Adventism's claim of being the remnant with a prophet, fulfilling the end time claim that Satan must be proven wrong, that God will be vindicated, and a people will rise up and keep the commandments. I just see that as a conundrum that unless the progressives somehow remove themselves from that or define themselves very clearly within the church, I can just never see the historicist, traditional Adventist, and the progressive Adventist ever coming to any kind of resolution. And here's the problem. Because it never does, because it's not like the Episcopalians or the Anglicans where people can find a niche and the broader church goes, yeah, we can accept that. Because Adventism can never do that. Here's the problem. Young people growing up into that kind of confusion actually never delight in the true teachings of Jesus and the gospel. They are anxious. They're worried about what other people think. They're worried about what they think. They're worried about what God thinks they think they do. And while there are many who say, hey, I don't think about those things anymore, and I don't even know much about Ellen White at all, trust me, you will stumble across it if you don't know, or your children will. The leadership from the beginning of Adventism to when Ellen White died promotes the pillars. And before Ellen White died, she continued to say the Great Controversy book needs to be out there, the whole world. She might have progressed in certain areas, but she never backed down from the core tenets of Adventism and its claim to be a unique remnant with the spirit of prophecy. So leadership, whenever they see the progressives rise up, they just shut them down. And the progressives are too scared to fully share their views for fear of losing their jobs, their status, their place in the hierarchy, what their friends will think. And yet they will anonymously or off to the side in the comments say, well, that's not my Adventism. Well, if it's not an Adventism you can boldly share publicly to help create a space for your kids to not fall into the pit of Great Controversy style Adventism, what are you doing? What on earth are you doing if you're not trying to create a space that allows young people growing up in the church and people coming into the church to not fall into these massive potholes of legalism that are everywhere? You cannot traverse or go on a journey within Adventism on the road from A to B without clunking into these massive potholes. It just cannot be done. And yeah, I'd love your thoughts on what I'm saying there. So, as I said, tonight, John Rosier, it'll be in, I think, 6 hours from now. 7 hours. What are we? 7 hours from now, I'm interviewing John Rosier. You guys in the States will be sound asleep. A bit late for a lot of Aussies watching and New Zealanders. Maybe those in Western Australia can watch. In the UK, it's only about going to be 9 a.m. in the morning. But we will be chatting about what Adventism could have been. And here's the big change from me personally. I'm not saying you should leave or stay. You do what you want. Look at the data, draw your own conclusions, use your brain. decide for yourself. I respect people that have thought about it, happily to publicly speak up or not, and have drawn their conclusions. I'm really happy. I don't have any claim to be happy or not, but I'm just, I respect that. But 5 years ago, I said to John Rosier, I think it was around that time, but a while back when he first came up with this presentation of what Adventism could have been, I said, or could be, let's make the title, What Adventism Could Have Been or Could Still Be. And now I'm not going to change that title. We're finally getting to do this program tonight with John Rosier. It's simply going to be called What Adventism Could Have Been. And progressive liberal Adventists, whatever category you fall under, unless you claim boldly what your Adventism is and stand up for it, what you hope for is never, ever going to happen. It will always just be what Adventism could have been, because it is currently not what you claim it is. You can go to your local church and have haystacks and say Happy Sabbath as much as you like and enjoy that. But collectively, the big picture of Adventism is not that. And a lot of people are harmed by the doctrine. Lose sleep at night, worry about the time of trouble. Yes, that stuff still happens for the majority of Adventists that come into this church. So hopefully you will join me tonight, Australian time, 10 p.m, 7 p.m, Western Australia. Got no idea what that is in Chicago there, Cindy Lou. But 9 a.m. in the UK. Check it out, and I hope to see some of you tonight. There's no show tomorrow, which means those that are going to be sleeping tonight, watch tomorrow at your usual time of watching SDAQ&A. Watch the John Rosier interview, What Adventism Could Have Been. And on this show, in the comments, let me know what you think. Am I wrong? Will Adventism's progressive, diminishing bubble of delusion find a place and a foothold and share in growing their movement? Or do you think, like me, that the final bell has rung and progressives are done for? It's not going to happen, guys. And it's sad, because I think, as John will be revealing tonight, there's some great qualities and things there. I think the Des Ford message of the 80s, late 70s, what a great thing that the church could have embraced. And the progressives, if they'd been bold enough and not scared to lose their jobs like they still are 45 years later, they would have benefited. The whole church would have benefited, instead of thousands and thousands of people leaving. I read somewhere that since the 60s, I need to get my facts right on this, but I think it's like 40 million people have left the Adventist church. So there's a lot of formers out there, and I'm proudly a former Adventist. And though I involve myself with these shows and really love the conversations, and I really love Adventist people that are conservative, in between, liberal, whatever. But these belief claims that are made by the Adventist church, you cannot live within Adventism and be an Adventist and just constantly have to justify Ellen White to one degree or not, or the other. You can't just keep saying, well, she was a flawed person, she was inspiring but not a prophet like a canonical one. You're just going to mess with your head, like I did until I was 54, messing with my head, trying to just make it all fit and all work. It's so liberating to not have to be within that realm. So great to see you guys today. I hope you've enjoyed the program, and we'll see the night owls or the early birds tonight. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Until next time.